In the spring of 1888, when University of Pennsylvania archaeologists first uncovered the temple library at Nippur in southern Iraq, they could not have anticipated the interpretive controversies their discovery would spark more than a century later. Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets extracted from the ancient Sumerian religious center, a particular class of texts described beings called the Anunnaki with such bureaucratic precision and administrative detail that they read less like mythological accounts and more like governmental records of an organized hierarchy managing specific terrestrial domains. The tablets, catalogued meticulously in museum collections from Philadelphia to Berlin, present a consistent portrait across multiple independent sources spanning over a millennium of Mesopotamian civilization. Yet the interpretation of these beings has diverged dramatically in modern discourse, with popular theories proposing extraterrestrial origins while academic scholarship maintains they represent divine judges and underworld deities within Mesopotamian religious cosmology. This documentary examines the primary textual evidence directly, analysing what the Sumerians and their Babylonian successors actually wrote about the Anunnaki in their own words, preserved in the cuneiform script that constituted humanity's first writing system. The evidence reveals neither ancient astronauts nor simple mythological inventions, but rather a sophisticated theological and administrative framework through which Mesopotamian civilization understood cosmic order, divine judgment, and the structures of legitimate authority. What emerges from careful textual analysis is a portrait of the Anunnaki as celestial administrators within a complex divine bureaucracy, beings whose primary functions centered on establishing cosmic law, judging the dead, and maintaining the boundary between the ordered world and the chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm it. The systematic excavation of Nippur between 1888 and 1900 by the University of Pennsylvania expedition, under the direction of John Punnett Peters and Hermann Hilprecht, recovered approximately 30,000 cuneiform tablets from the temple complex of Enlil, the Sumerian god of wind and supreme authority in the early Mesopotamian pantheon. Among these tablets, administrative records, literary compositions, and ritual texts repeatedly reference the Anunnaki as a collective group of divine beings with specific judicial and cosmic maintenance functions. The archaeological context of these discoveries provides crucial foundation for understanding what the ancient Mesopotamians actually believed about these beings. The tablets emerge from stratified deposits within the temple precinct, many found in situ within the Scribal quarter, where generations of priests had copied, studied, and archived religious literature. This controlled archaeological recovery allows modern scholars to date the texts with precision and understand their original institutional context. The Nippur collection represents the largest single repository of Sumerian literary and religious texts ever discovered, providing an unparalleled window into how Mesopotamian civilization understood divine hierarchy and cosmic order across more than a millennium of continuous religious tradition. The tablets themselves demonstrate remarkable consistency in their portrayal of the Anunnaki despite spanning vast chronological periods. Early dynastic texts from approximately 2600 BC describe the Anunnaki in terms nearly identical to those found in Neo-Babylonian compositions written 2,000 years later. This textual stability indicates that the concept represented a fixed element of Mesopotamian theology, rather than evolving speculation or mythological embellishment. The cuneiform script employed to record these texts evolved significantly over this period, from the pictographic characters of early Sumerian writing to the sophisticated syllabic system of later Akkadian and Babylonian literature, yet the core descriptions of Anunnaki identity and function remained constant. Multiple independent Scribal traditions from different Mesopotamian cities including Uruk, Lagash, and Babylon preserved virtually identical accounts, suggesting that this theological understanding enjoyed broad acceptance across Mesopotamian civilization, rather than representing the beliefs of isolated cult centers. The physical preservation of these texts reflects deliberate efforts by Mesopotamian scribes to maintain authoritative versions of religious literature. Many tablets show evidence of having been copied from earlier exemplars, with scribal colophons explicitly stating the source manuscripts and attesting to the accuracy of reproduction. The tablet catalogued as Nippur CBS 10673, now housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, preserves a literary composition describing divine council proceedings where the Anunnaki appear as juridical assessors evaluating human conduct. The scribe who copied this text in approximately 1800 BC noted in the colophon that he worked from an exemplar dating 3 centuries earlier, demonstrating the transmission chains that preserved these theological concepts across generations. The care invested in this textual preservation argues against dismissing these compositions as mere entertainment or propaganda. The institutional resources devoted to maintaining scribal schools, training copyists, and archiving thousands of tablets indicate that Mesopotamian civilization regarded this literature as containing essential information about cosmic order and divine administration. Archaeological analysis of the Nippur temple complex reveals the social and institutional context within which these texts functioned. The Akur temple of Enlil served as both religious center and administrative hub, where priestly bureaucrats managed vast agricultural estates, conducted elaborate rituals, and maintained the theological knowledge systems that legitimized royal authority throughout Mesopotamia. The scribes who composed and copied texts describing the Anunnaki operated within this institutional framework, their work supported by temple endowments and supervised by senior priests who ensured doctrinal consistency. The physical layout of the scribal quarter includes specialized rooms for tablet storage, workspaces equipped with clay preparation facilities, and what appear to be teaching areas where master scribes instructed apprentices in the complex cuneiform writing system and the theological content it recorded. This institutional investment in textual production and preservation demonstrates that descriptions of the Anunnaki represented official religious doctrine rather than speculative fiction or alternative interpretations. The diversity of text genres mentioning the Anunnaki further illuminates their role in Mesopotamian thought. Administrative documents recording temple offerings occasionally invoke the Anunnaki as witnesses to legal transactions, suggesting these beings possess juridical authority recognized in everyday legal practice. Ritual texts prescribe specific offerings and invocations directed toward the Anunnaki collective, indicating that priests understood these beings as active participants in the cosmic order who required proper propitiation. Literary compositions, including mythological narratives, hymns, and wisdom literature, consistently portray the Anunnaki as deliberative assembly members who debate, vote, and issue binding decrees that determine both divine and human fates. This multi-genre consistency demonstrates that the Anunnaki concept pervaded Mesopotamian culture at all levels, from elite theological speculation to popular religious practice. The textual evidence recovered from Nippur and other Mesopotamian sites provides scholars with unprecedented access to how an ancient civilization systematically articulated its understanding of cosmic governance, divine hierarchy, and the relationship between celestial authority and earthly administration. The Sumerian term AN-NUNNA-KI appears in cuneiform as a combination of 3 elements: An, the word for heaven or sky god; Nun, which carries meanings related to princely status or nobility; and Kai, meaning earth or foundation. Linguistic analysis by Assyriologists including Samuel Noah Kramer and Thorkild Jacobsen established that the most accurate translation renders AN-NUNNA-KI as those of princely seed or offspring of An. This etymology directly connects the Anunnaki to An, the supreme deity in early Sumerian cosmology, who personified the heavens and represented ultimate divine authority. The linguistic construction follows standard Sumerian grammatical patterns for expressing genealogical relationships and social status, indicating that ancient scribes understood the Anunnaki as a defined class of divine beings distinguished by their descent from the highest god. The term functions as a collective designation rather than a personal name, similar to how terms like nobility or aristocracy denote social classes rather than individuals. Sumerian grammar employs specific morphological markers to indicate plurality and collective identity, and the Anunnaki designation consistently appears with these markers across thousands of textual attestations. The component N that begins the term identifies the sky god who headed the Sumerian pantheon during the 3rd millennium BC, and personified the heavens themselves, representing the dome of sky that arches over the earth and separates the ordered cosmos from the primordial waters above. Early Sumerian religious texts describe An as the source of legitimate authority, the distant sovereign who delegates administrative functions to more active deities while retaining ultimate supremacy. The city of Uruk maintained An's primary cult center, where a massive temple complex called the Inanna, meaning House of Heaven, served as his earthly residence. The prominence of An's name in the Anunnaki designation indicates these beings derived their authority from direct relationship with the supreme deity, functioning as his offspring or representatives rather than as independent powers. The middle component Nun carries semantic weight that has generated scholarly debate, but ultimately reinforces the interpretation of the Anunnaki as divine nobility. The Sumerian word Nun appears in various contexts meaning prince, lord, or noble person, always indicating elevated social status and administrative authority. When applied to divine beings, it denotes membership in the ruling class of the divine world, those gods who hold authority over cosmic domains, rather than serving subordinate functions. The linguistic combination of An and Nun creates a compound meaning princely offspring of An, or noble descendants of heaven, establishing the Anunnaki as an aristocratic class within the divine hierarchy. This social stratification mirrors the earthly political structures of Sumerian city-states, where ruling elites claimed descent from city gods and exercised authority delegated from divine sources. The Mesopotamian scribes who coined and employed this terminology understood divine society as organized according to the same hierarchical principles that structured human civilization. The final component, ki, meaning earth or foundation, appears in some scholarly analyses as part of the full term, though linguistic evidence remains somewhat ambiguous regarding whether ki functioned as an integral element of the word or as a grammatical marker. If ki does form part of the core designation, it would establish the AN-NUNNA-KI as beings positioned between heaven and earth, mediating between An's celestial supremacy and the terrestrial realm of human existence. This intermediate positioning aligns with their documented functions as judges and administrators who apply divine law to human conduct and natural phenomena. Alternative linguistic analysis suggests ki might function as a locative marker indicating where the Anunnaki exercise their authority, essentially designating them as celestial princes who operate within the earthly realm. Either interpretation supports understanding the Anunnaki as divine administrators, rather than as mythological inventions or extraterrestrial visitors. Comparative linguistic analysis reveals that when Sumerian religious terminology was translated into Akkadian, the Semitic language that gradually displaced Sumerian as the spoken tongue of Mesopotamia after approximately 2000 BC, the term Anunnaki was rendered as Anunnaku, preserving the essential meaning while adapting to Akkadian phonology and grammar. This linguistic continuity across language replacement demonstrates that the concept remained stable even as the broader culture underwent significant transformation. Akkadian scribes understood the Anunnaki designation well enough to accurately translate it into their own language using equivalent grammatical constructions and semantic elements. The Akkadian rendering maintains the connection to Anu, the Akkadian form of An, while adapting the plural formation to Semitic linguistic patterns. This translation process reveals that bilingual scribes who bridged Sumerian and Akkadian cultures recognized the Anunnaki as an established theological category, requiring precise terminological equivalence, rather than as a vague mythological concept open to reinterpretation. The consistent spelling and grammatical treatment of the term Anunnaki across thousands of cuneiform texts spanning multiple dialects, time periods, and geographical regions argues against theories that would reinterpret the beings as anything other than what the linguistic evidence plainly indicates, a class of divine beings understood by Mesopotamian civilization as noble offspring of the supreme sky god. Variant spellings that occasionally appear in texts reflect scribal errors or dialectical differences rather than fundamental confusion about the being's identity. The overwhelming textual consensus preserves a stable designation that ancient scribes employed with consistent meaning across 2 millennia of literary production. This linguistic stability provides modern scholars with confident foundation for understanding what Mesopotamians actually meant when they wrote about the Anunnaki, grounding interpretation in philological evidence rather than speculation. The Babylonian creation epic known as Enuma Elish, preserved on 7 tablets discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and dating to approximately 1200 BC, though based on earlier Sumerian sources, provides the most detailed account of Anunnaki origins within Mesopotamian cosmogony. The text describes how the primordial gods Apsu, representing fresh water, and Tiamat, representing salt water, produce successive generations of divine beings through their mingling, establishing the fundamental pattern of divine genealogy that would structure all subsequent Mesopotamian theology. The epic begins with a time before time, when nothing existed except these two primordial principles and the waters they embodied. From their union emerged the first generation of gods, who in turn produced further generations in an expanding divine family tree that eventually included the Anunnaki among its branches. This genealogical framework establishes the Anunnaki not as external visitors or alien beings, but as integral participants in the cosmic family descended from the universe's foundational elements. The narrative progression of Enuma Elish describes mounting conflict between younger and older divine generations as the energetic new gods disturbed the primordial peace with their activity and noise. Apsu grew increasingly, disturbed by the younger gods' tumult and plotted their destruction. But Ea, the god of wisdom and fresh water, discovered the conspiracy and killed Apsu before the plan could be executed. This divine patricide established a pattern of generational conflict that would culminate in Marduk's cosmic battle. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death, raised an army of monsters and appointed the god Kingu as her champion, giving him the tablet of destinies that conferred supreme authority over cosmic forces. The younger gods, terrified by Tiamat's army, searched desperately for a champion who could face her in battle. Marduk, son of Ea and representing the rising power of Babylon, agreed to fight Tiamat but demanded supreme authority over all gods in exchange for his service. The divine assembly agreed to Marduk's terms, and the young god armed himself with winds, storms, and magical weapons for the confrontation. The epic describes the battle in vivid detail as Marduk ensnared Tiamat in his net, sent the evil wind into her mouth to distend her body, then shot an arrow into her belly that split her in two. From Tiamat's corpse, Marduk fashioned the structures of the ordered cosmos, using half her body to create the dome of heaven and half to form the foundation of earth. He arranged the stars and planets in their courses, established the calendar with its months and seasons, and assigned the various gods to their cosmic stations. This creative act transformed chaos into order, establishing the structured universe within which civilization could flourish. The Anunnaki appear in this narrative as divine beings who witness and participate in these cosmic events, their origins tied to the same genealogical processes that produced all the gods. After establishing cosmic order, Marduk proposed creating humanity to serve the gods and relieve them of laborious work. The Divine Council agreed to this plan, and Kingu, Tiamat's defeated champion who had led the rebellion, was executed as punishment for his role in the conflict. From king's blood mixed with clay, Ea fashioned the first humans, creatures designed specifically to perform the labour that had previously burdened the gods. This creation narrative establishes humanity's subordinate position within the cosmic hierarchy, while explaining human purpose as service to divine authority. The Anunnaki feature in this creation as beneficiaries of human labour, divine nobles freed from toil by the convenient invention of servile humanity. The text makes clear that humans were created as workers, not as equals or companions to the gods, establishing a hierarchical relationship that would characterize Mesopotamian theology throughout its existence. The Enuma Elish describes the Anunnaki as active participants in the events surrounding creation and the establishment of divine order, but always as members of the divine community rather than as external agents. They appear in the assembly scenes where gods debate, courses of action, they witness Marduk's victory in the creation of the cosmos, and they receive the benefits of human creation. Their characterization throughout the epic remains consistent with their portrayal in other Mesopotamian literature as divine nobles who form part of the celestial bureaucracy. The text never suggests they arrived from elsewhere or existed independently of the cosmogonic processes that generated all divine beings. Instead, they emerge from the same genealogical sequences that produced the entire divine pantheon. Younger gods descended from earlier generations who trace their ultimate lineage back to the primordial waters. The 7 tablets of Enuma Elish were discovered in remarkably complete form among the approximately 30,000 tablets that comprised Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. Ashurbanipal, who ruled Assyria from 669 to approximately 631 BC, assembled the ancient world's most comprehensive collection of cuneiform literature, sending scribes throughout Mesopotamia to copy texts from temple archives and private collections. The library catalogue indicates that Ashurbanipal's scribes recognized Enuma Elish as an authoritative version of creation theology, worthy of careful preservation and study. The tablets themselves bear colophons identifying them as copies of earlier Babylonian exemplars, demonstrating that the composition enjoyed canonical status for centuries before Ashurbanipal's reign. Archaeological context and paleographic analysis confirm the tablets date to the 7th century BC, but the content clearly derives from Middle Babylonian traditions of the 2nd millennium, which in turn drew upon even earlier Sumerian cosmogonic myths. Tablet 6 of the Enuma Elish specifies that after Marduk's victory over Tiamat and the creation of the ordered cosmos, 50 great gods assembled to establish the fundamental structures of reality. The text states that these 50 Anunnaki were assigned specific cosmic responsibilities and established in their shrines, creating a divine bureaucracy that mirrored the administrative structures of Babylonian imperial governance. The precise number 50 holds significance within Mesopotamian numerical symbolism, representing completion and totality, while also reflecting the actual administrative organization of Babylonian government, which frequently employed councils of 50 officials to manage provincial affairs. This numerical correspondence suggests that Mesopotamian theologians understood divine administration as operating according to principles similar to those governing human bureaucracy, with delegation of authority, specialized departments, and hierarchical reporting structures. The text describes how Marduk assigned each of the 50 Anunnaki to specific cosmic responsibilities, distributing the work of maintaining universal order among qualified administrators. Some received oversight of celestial phenomena, managing the movements of stars and planets according to the calendar Marduk established. Others took responsibility for terrestrial domains, including weather patterns, agricultural fertility, and the proper functioning of rivers and irrigation systems. Still others received judicial functions, determining fates and rendering judgments according to cosmic law. This division of labor created a comprehensive administrative system that ensured all aspects of the ordered cosmos received proper divine attention and management. The epic emphasizes that these assignments were permanent positions, with each Anunnaki established in their shrines, meaning temples built to house their presence and facilitate their administrative functions. The establishment of these divine shrines created physical infrastructure connecting heaven and earth, allowing the Anunnaki to exercise their cosmic responsibilities through material presence in specific geographical locations. Each major Mesopotamian city maintained temples dedicated to particular gods, and these temples functioned simultaneously as religious centers, economic institutions, and administrative headquarters. The shrines mentioned in Enuma Elish correspond to actual temple complexes excavated by archaeologists throughout Iraq, physical structures where priests performed rituals, managed agricultural estates, and conducted the business of divine administration. The text's description of establishing Anunnaki in their shrines thus refers to organizing the institutional framework through which divine authority operated in the material world, connecting theological concepts to concrete religious practice. The assembly of the 50 great gods described in Tablet 6 represents a formal constitutional convention establishing the legal and administrative foundations of cosmic order. The text employs terminology borrowed from Babylonian political assemblies, describing the gods as deliberating, reaching consensus and formally decreeing the organizational structures that would govern reality. This legislative assembly issued what the text calls the destinies, binding decrees that established fundamental laws governing divine and human existence. The destinies functioned as cosmic constitution, setting parameters that even the gods themselves could not arbitrarily violate. Marduk, though supreme among the gods, exercised his authority within the framework established by this divine constitutional assembly, rather than through arbitrary personal whim. The Anunnaki who comprised this assembly held authority deriving from multiple sources, including genealogical position as offspring of An, demonstrated competence in cosmic administration, and formal appointment by Marduk in his role as king of the gods. Their authority was therefore constitutional rather than absolute, exercised according to established procedures and subject to the fundamental laws decreed by the divine assembly. This complex understanding of divine authority reflects sophisticated Mesopotamian political thought regarding the sources and limits of legitimate power. Even supreme authority operated within legal frameworks and required consultation with qualified councils. The 50 Anunnaki represented this constitutional principle in cosmic form, embodying the idea that legitimate governance requires consultation, deliberation, and adherence to established law. The bureaucratic organization described in Enuma Elish created multiple tiers of divine authority with clear reporting relationships and jurisdictional boundaries. Marduk held supreme executive authority as king of the gods, but the Anunnaki assembly possessed legislative and judicial powers that checked his authority. Lower-ranking gods served under Anunnaki supervision, carrying out assigned tasks while the Anunnaki provided oversight and coordination. This hierarchical structure ensured that cosmic administration functioned efficiently while preventing concentration of excessive power in any single divine office. The parallel with Babylonian imperial administration was explicit and intentional, with divine bureaucracy serving as both model for and legitimation of earthly governmental structures. The most consistent function attributed to the Anunnaki across Mesopotamian literature positions them as judges who determine the fates of deceased souls in the underworld. The Epic of Gilgamesh, particularly in Tablet 7 where Enkidu describes his prophetic dream of the afterlife, portrays the Anunnaki seated in judgment assembly presided over by the goddess Ereshkigal and her scribe Belit-Seri. This judicial function represents the most universally attested role for the Anunnaki in cuneiform sources, appearing in texts spanning the entire chronological range of Mesopotamian civilization from early dynastic Sumerian compositions through Neo-Babylonian literature of the first millennium BC. The consistency of this portrayal across diverse text types, including myths, royal inscriptions, ritual texts, and wisdom. Literature demonstrates that Mesopotamians understood judgment of the dead as the primary responsibility of the Anunnaki collective. Enkidu's dream vision in the Gilgamesh Epic provides the most detailed description of Anunnaki judicial proceedings in the underworld. The text describes how Enkidu, suffering from illness sent by the gods as punishment for his role in killing the Bull of Heaven, experiences a prophetic dream revealing the afterlife that awaits him. In the dream, a terrifying figure with eagle talons seizes Enkidu and drags him down to the House of Darkness, the Mesopotamian underworld realm called Irkalla. There Enkidu witnesses the condition of the dead, including former kings and priests now serving as menial labourers in the dust and darkness. The dream climaxes with Enkidu's appearance before the divine court, where the Anunnaki sit in assembly to judge the newly dead. The text describes Ereshkigal, queen, of the underworld, presiding over the assembly from her throne while her scribe Belit-Seri kneels beside her with tablet and stylus ready to record the court's decisions. The Anunnaki judges are arrayed before the throne, and as each soul appears, Belit-Seri reads from the tablet of destinies the record of that person's deeds during life. The Anunnaki deliberate regarding each case, weighing the evidence of the deceased's conduct against cosmic law to determine appropriate fate. Some souls receive favourable judgments, allowing them to dwell in relatively comfortable areas of the underworld, while others face harsher punishment, including consignment to the deepest darkness. The judicial procedure described follows formal legal protocols familiar from Mesopotamian court proceedings, with presentation of evidence, deliberation among qualified judges, and pronouncement of binding verdict. The role of Belit-Seri as recording scribe highlights the bureaucratic nature of this judicial process. Her title translates as Lady of the Steppe, or Mistress of the Open Country, but in the underworld she functions as divine archivist, maintaining comprehensive records of human conduct. Her tablet contains the complete account of each person's life, a permanent record that cannot be altered or disputed. This concept of divine record-keeping reinforced Mesopotamian ethical behaviour during life, as individuals understood that their actions were being documented for eventual review by the Anunnaki judges. The Tablet of Destinies from which Belit-Seri reads represents the ultimate legal authority, containing not only records of past conduct, but also the fundamental laws against which that conduct would be evaluated. The physical setting of this divine court in the underworld realm reflects Mesopotamian cosmological geography. The underworld existed as a mirror image of the world above, containing cities, palaces, and administrative structures paralleling those of earthly civilization but located beneath the surface of the earth. Souls reached this realm by passing through 7 gates, at each of which they surrendered items of clothing and adornment, until arriving naked before the judgment assembly. This stripping away of earthly status symbols ensured that the Anunnaki judges evaluated each soul based solely on conduct, rather than on wealth or social position achieved during life. Kings and peasants appeared identically before the divine court, their earthly distinctions meaningless in the face of cosmic justice. Additional texts corroborate and expand upon this judicial portrayal of the Anunnaki. The Descent of Inanna describes how even the goddess Inanna, when she descended to the underworld, faced judgment by the AN-NUNNA-KI assembly. The 7 AN-NUNNA-KI judges affixed upon her the Eye of Death, and she became a corpse, demonstrating that divine law applied even to major deities. The text emphasizes the Anunnaki's judicial independence as they rendered judgment according to cosmic law, rather than showing favoritism based on the defendant's divine status. This episode established the principle that the AN-NUNNA-KI functioned as impartial arbiters of justice, rather than as tools of political power or divine favoritism. Sumerian cosmology divided existence into 3 primary realms: An, the heavens ruled by the sky god; Kai, the earth inhabited by humans; and Kur, the underworld realm of the dead. While later Babylonian theology sometimes placed Anunnaki in celestial contexts, the earliest Sumerian sources consistently associate them with Kur, the Great Below, where they functioned as administrators of the dead. This underworld location appears repeatedly in the oldest surviving cuneiform texts, establishing a pattern that would persist throughout Mesopotamian religious literature, despite later theological developments that occasionally assigned some Anunnaki members to celestial positions. The term Kur itself carries multiple meanings in Sumerian, denoting both the underworld and foreign mountain lands, suggesting that ancient Mesopotamians understood the realm of the dead as existing beneath the mountains that ring their river valley homeland. Archaeological evidence from burial practices confirms that Mesopotamians conceived the afterlife as a subterranean realm where the dead continued a shadowy existence under Anunnaki supervision. The physical geography of Kur as described in Sumerian texts created a mirror world beneath the Earth's surface, containing cities, palaces, and administrative structures that paralleled those of the living world above. The underworld city possessed 7 gates through which souls passed on their journey to the land of no return, each gate stripping away aspects of earthly identity until the deceased arrived naked and powerless before the Anunnaki judges. The Sumerian term for the underworld, Kur-Nugia, translates as the land of no return, emphasizing the permanence of death and the impossibility of escaping Anunnaki jurisdiction once judgment had been rendered. This inexorable finality distinguished the Mesopotamian afterlife from other ancient Near Eastern conceptions that sometimes allowed for resurrection or escape from the realm of the dead. The consistent association of Anunnaki with Kur in early Sumerian texts provides strong evidence for understanding their primary function as underworld administrators rather than celestial visitors or earthly rulers. The composition known as Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, dating to approximately 2100 BC, describes how the Anunnaki dwell in Kur and exercise authority over the dead who populate that realm. The text employs standard Sumerian terminology for underground location and uses conventional grammatical constructions indicating permanent residence rather than temporary visitation. The Anunnaki appear as native inhabitants of the underworld who have always occupied that realm, rather than as beings who descended from elsewhere to assume underworld responsibilities. This indigenous underworld status contradicts modern theories that would position the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors or earthly colonizers. Temple hymns from the city of Lagash, dating to approximately 2400 BC, invoke the Anunnaki as judges of Kur, who determine the fates of the deceased according to their conduct during life. These hymns employ technical legal terminology describing the Anunnaki as rendering verdicts, pronouncing sentences, and executing judgments that consign souls to appropriate regions of the underworld based on the evidence of their earthly behavior. The juridical language mirrors that used in contemporaneous legal documents recording court proceedings in Sumerian city-states, suggesting that worshippers understood the Anunnaki as operating according to established legal procedures rather than exercising arbitrary divine whim. The hymns request favorable judgment from the Anunnaki, indicating that petitioners believed ethical conduct during life could influence the court's verdict and result in more comfortable conditions in the afterlife. The architectural layout of Mesopotamian temples incorporated this underworld association through the inclusion of crypts, underground chambers, and subterranean passages that symbolically connected the temple to Kur. Excavations at Eridu, considered the oldest Sumerian city, revealed that the temple dedicated to Enki contained elaborate underground chambers extending deep beneath the structure's foundation. These subterranean spaces functioned as ritual sites where priests performed ceremonies invoking underworld deities including the Anunnaki collective. The physical construction of temples with significant underground components materialize the theological connection between earthly worship and the underworld realm, where the Anunnaki exercise their primary authority. Priests descending into these underground chambers during ritual performances enacted symbolic journeys to Kur, accessing the realm where the Anunnaki maintained their permanent residence. Later Babylonian texts occasionally describe some Anunnaki as dwelling in heaven or on earth, representing theological development that distributed the Anunnaki collective across multiple cosmic realms. However, even these later sources maintain that the primary Anunnaki assembly met in the underworld under Ereshkigal's presidency, with celestial or terrestrial Anunnaki travelling to Kur for assembly sessions where fates were determined and judgments rendered. The tablet catalogued as K3454 in the British Museum collection, dating to the 7th century BC, describes how the Anunnaki of heaven and earth descend to the great below for the assembly of destinies, confirming that even when some members held positions in other realms, the collective's primary jurisdiction remained the underworld. This theological refinement expanded Anunnaki presence across the cosmos, while preserving their fundamental association with Kur and their essential function as judges of the dead. The Atrahasis Epic, composed in Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC but preserving earlier Sumerian traditions, describes a fundamental distinction between two classes of divine beings, the Anunnaki, who held positions of authority, and the Igigi, who performed the laborious work of maintaining cosmic order. The text recounts how the Igigi rebelled against their endless toil, forcing the Anunnaki leadership to devise an alternative solution that would relieve divine labourers of their burdensome responsibilities. This narrative provides crucial insight into how Mesopotamian theology understood divine hierarchy and the distribution of labour within the cosmic administration. The epic begins by describing a time when the Igigi bore the workload, digging rivers, clearing channels, and performing the exhausting physical labour necessary to maintain the irrigation systems upon which Mesopotamian agriculture depended. The text employs technical terminology for hydraulic engineering, describing how the Igigi excavated the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, establishing the geographical foundations upon which civilization would later flourish. The narrative emphasizes the oppressive nature of this divine labour through vivid descriptions of the Igigi's suffering. For 40 years, the Igigi carried the workload, digging day and night without rest, while the Anunnaki supervisors demanded ever greater productivity. The text describes how the Igigi counted the years of toil, marked their endless suffering, and finally reached the breaking point where continued submission became impossible. The epic portrays this divine labour system as fundamentally unjust, creating conditions so intolerable that even immortal beings could no longer endure them. This theological critique of exploitative labour relations reflects actual social conditions in Old Babylonian Mesopotamia, where massive irrigation projects required enormous forced labour contributions from subject populations who worked under brutal conditions to build the infrastructure that enriched temple and palace establishments. The Igigi rebellion begins when the labourers burn their tools and march on Enlil's temple in Nippur, surrounding the divine palace in the night and demanding relief from their oppression. The text describes the terror this revolt inspired among the Anunnaki leadership, who found themselves confronted by their subordinates' united resistance. Enlil, chief of the Anunnaki Council, initially proposed crushing the rebellion through military force, but Ea, the god of wisdom, advocated for a diplomatic solution that would address the underlying grievances. The Divine Council deliberated extensively regarding appropriate response, with different Anunnaki members proposing various strategies for handling the crisis. This assembly debate reveals sophisticated understanding of political dynamics, acknowledging that legitimate grievances required substantive remedies rather than simple suppression through force. The solution proposed by Ea and accepted by the Anunnaki Council involved creating humanity to assume the labour burden that had driven the Igigi to rebellion. The text describes how the goddess Belet Ili, working under Ea's direction, fashioned the first humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, creating beings specifically designed to perform agricultural labour and maintain the irrigation systems. This human creation relieved the Igigi of their toil, establishing a new cosmic order where humans bore the workload while divine beings enjoyed leisure and received human service through temple offerings and ritual labour. The epic presents this arrangement as benefiting all parties, The Igigi gained relief from oppression. The Anunnaki maintained the infrastructure necessary for cosmic order, and humans received the privilege of serving divine purposes. The distinction between Anunnaki and Igigi that structures the Atrahasis narrative appears consistently throughout Mesopotamian literature, establishing a fundamental division within divine society between ruling and labouring classes. The Anunnaki occupied positions of authority as administrators, judges, and executives who set policy and rendered decisions, while the Igigi performed the manual labour necessary to implement those policies and maintain cosmic infrastructure. This class division within divine society mirrored the social stratification of Mesopotamian civilization, where ruling elites lived on agricultural surplus produced by peasant labour, while temple and palace bureaucracies administered complex economic systems. The theological projection of earthly social relations onto the divine realm simultaneously naturalized human inequality by presenting it as cosmic principle and provided framework for critiquing excessive exploitation through narratives like the Igigi Rebellion. The Atrahasis Epic survives in multiple copies from different periods and locations throughout Mesopotamia, demonstrating that this narrative enjoyed wide circulation and authoritative status within Mesopotamian religious tradition. The most complete version was discovered at Sippar and is now housed in the British Museum as tablet number BM 78941. Fragmentary copies have been recovered from Nineveh, Assur, and Babylon, indicating that scribes throughout Mesopotamia considered this text important enough to copy, study, and preserve. The consistency of the Anunnaki-Igigi distinction across all these versions confirms that this represented standard Mesopotamian theology, rather than the idiosyncratic invention of individual authors. Later Babylonian commentaries on the epic discuss the theological implications of divine class structure, demonstrating that ancient scholars recognized the text's social critique and engaged seriously with questions about legitimate authority and the ethics of labor exploitation. The Sumerian poem Descent of Inanna, among the oldest literary compositions known to humanity, with versions dating to approximately 2300 BC, describes the goddess Inanna's journey to the underworld realm, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. The text provides crucial details about Anunnaki function and organization within the underworld administrative hierarchy. The narrative begins with Inanna abandoning heaven and earth to descend to the great below, driven by curiosity or ambition to extend her dominion over the realm of the dead. Before departing, Inanna instructs her servant Ninshubur to appeal to the great gods for rescue if she fails to return within 3 days, revealing that even powerful deities recognize the danger of entering Anunnaki jurisdiction in the underworld. This precautionary measure acknowledges that the Anunnaki possessed authority so absolute within their domain that even major gods risked permanent detention if they violated underworld protocols. The text describes Inanna's descent through 7 gates, at each of which the gatekeeper demands she remove an item of clothing or adornment until she arrives naked before Ereshkigal's throne. This ritual stripping represents the removal of divine powers and earthly authority, reducing Inanna to fundamental essence without the trappings of status or the protections of office. The gatekeeper at each level acts under instructions from Ereshkigal, demonstrating the administrative hierarchy that structures underworld governance with clear chains of command and established procedures that even visiting deities must observe. The progression through multiple checkpoints mirrors the bureaucratic organization of Mesopotamian palaces and temples, where visitors pass through successive courts and antechambers before reaching the inner sanctum where authority resided. Upon reaching the throne room, Inanna faces judgment by the Anunnaki assembly. The text describes how the 7 Anunnaki judges sit in session and fix upon Inanna the eye of death, immediately transforming the goddess into a corpse that Ereshkigal hangs on a hook like a piece of meat. This swift judgment and execution demonstrates the Anunnaki's absolute authority within their jurisdiction, as they condemn even a major deity without extended deliberation or appeals process. The phrase eye of death appears throughout Mesopotamian literature as technical terminology for judicial condemnation, with the Anunnaki's gaze functioning as the mechanism through which judgment transforms into material consequence. The violent imagery of Inanna's corpse hanging on a hook emphasizes the finality of Anunnaki verdicts and the terrible power these judges wielded over all who entered their domain. The text specifies that 7 Anunnaki participated in this judicial assembly, a number that appears frequently in Mesopotamian descriptions of the underworld court. This specific enumeration suggests a formal council structure with defined membership rather than a fluctuating assembly of variable composition. The consistency of this 7-member configuration across multiple independent texts indicates that Mesopotamian theology understood the Supreme Anunnaki court as comprising exactly 7 judges who held ultimate authority over life and death. This septenary organization may reflect actual Mesopotamian judicial practice, as various legal documents reference courts of 7 judges who heard capital cases in human legal systems. The theological projection of earthly court structure onto divine judgment reinforced the legitimacy of human legal institutions by presenting them as reflecting cosmic precedent. Inanna's rescue comes only through Ea's intervention after 3 days, when the god of wisdom fashions artificial beings who descend to the underworld and successfully petition Ereshkigal for Inanna's release. However, the AN-NUNNA-KI impose strict conditions on this release, demanding that Inanna provide a substitute to take her place in the realm of the dead. This requirement demonstrates that the Anunnaki operated according to cosmic law that required balance and exchange rather than arbitrary personal preference. Souls could not simply leave the underworld without compensation, as this would disrupt the fundamental order that separated the realm of the living from the domain of the dead. The substitution principle established that the Anunnaki functioned as administrators of cosmic balance, who enforced rules governing transitions between different states of existence. The Descent of Inanna provides the earliest detailed description of Anunnaki organization and function, establishing patterns that would persist throughout subsequent Mesopotamian literature. The text presents the Anunnaki as judicial assembly members who operate according to established procedures, enforce cosmic law without favoritism even when judging major deities, and maintain absolute authority within their designated jurisdiction. Their characterization as 7 judges rather than individual deities or undifferentiated collective emphasizes their role as institutional authorities whose power derives from position within a larger administrative structure rather than from personal characteristics. This institutional understanding of divine authority shaped Mesopotamian political thought, establishing precedent for conceptualizing legitimate power as residing in offices and procedures rather than in individual rulers. The Tablet of Destinies appears throughout Mesopotamian literature as the supreme symbol of cosmic authority and administrative power. Various texts describe this object as containing the fundamental laws and decrees that govern reality itself. The Anunnaki relationship to this tablet reveals their function as executors of divine law rather than independent lawmakers. The tablet first appears in Sumerian texts as the Dup Shemati, literally meaning Tablet of Fates, and carries into Akkadian literature as the Tup Shemati, with essentially unchanged meaning and function. References to this powerful object span the entire chronological range of Mesopotamian civilization, from early dynastic texts around 2600 BC through Neo-Babylonian compositions of the 6th century BC, demonstrating the concept's centrality to Mesopotamian understanding of cosmic governance. The tablet embodied the principle that legitimate authority requires written law and administrative documentation, rather than resting solely on personal power or charismatic leadership. The Tablet of Destinies contained the fundamental decrees that established cosmic order after the creation, including the laws governing celestial movements, seasonal cycles, natural phenomena, and the proper relationships between gods, humans, and the natural world. Possession of this tablet conferred supreme authority because it granted the holder control over the cosmic mechanisms through which divine will manifested in material reality. However, the tablet itself did not create these laws, but rather recorded and administered them, distinguishing legislative from executive authority within divine governance. The Anunnaki relationship to this tablet positioned them as administrators who implemented the decrees rather than as the ultimate source of cosmic law, reinforcing their characterization as bureaucratic functionaries rather than supreme authorities. The myth of Anzu, preserved in Old Babylonian, Middle Assyrian, and Neo-Assyrian versions, describes how the monstrous bird Anzu stole the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil, temporarily disrupting cosmic order until the god Ninurta recovered the tablet through combat. The narrative emphasizes the chaos that ensued when the tablet fell into unauthorized hands as cosmic mechanisms ceased functioning properly, and divine authority became paralyzed. The Anunnaki appear in this myth as witnesses to the theft and participants in the crisis resolution, but not as the tablet's rightful possessors. Their role involves supporting legitimate authority and helping restore proper order rather than wielding supreme power themselves. When Ninurta successfully recovers the tablet and returns it to Enlil, the Anunnaki Assembly formally ratifies this restoration of legitimate authority, demonstrating their function as validators and enforcers of cosmic law. The Enuma Elish describes how Tiamat gave the Tablet of Destinies to Kingu, appointing him as leader of her army in rebellion against the younger gods. This transfer of the tablet represented the highest possible delegation of authority, conferring upon King the power to issue binding decrees and exercise supreme command. When Marduk defeated Tiamat and her forces, he seized the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu and presented it to Anu, the sky god who represented ultimate divine authority. The Anunnaki Assembly then formally recognized Marduk's supremacy based on his recovery and proper disposition of this supreme symbol of authority. Their recognition validated Marduk's claim to kingship over the gods, demonstrating that the Anunnaki possessed authority to confirm or deny claims to supreme power based on proper possession and administration of the cosmic law embodied in the tablet. Various administrative and ritual texts describe how the Anunnaki consulted the Tablet of Destinies when rendering judgments, reading from it the decrees that governed particular situations and applying those laws to specific cases. This consultative process distinguished the Anunnaki as judicial interpreters who applied established law rather than as legislators who created new decrees according to personal preference. The tablet served as constitutional document constraining even divine authority, requiring that judgments conform to established precedent and cosmic law. The concept of written law, superseding arbitrary authority, represented a sophisticated political principle that influenced Mesopotamian legal development, ultimately contributing to creation of law codes like those of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi that claim divine origin and binding authority independent of royal whim. The physical form of the Tablet of Destinies remains somewhat ambiguous in the textual sources, with different compositions describing it variously as a single tablet, a series of tablets, or a comprehensive archive of cosmic law. Some texts suggest it possessed supernatural properties, including the ability to speak, shine with brilliant light, or respond to proper ritual invocations. These descriptions indicate that Mesopotamians understood the tablet as more than simple written document, instead conceiving it as embodying cosmic authority in material form that could be accessed, consulted and administered through proper procedures. The AN-NUNNA-KI, mastery of these procedures qualified them to serve as divine judges and administrators, possessing the technical knowledge necessary to interpret cosmic law and apply it to specific cases requiring adjudication. Mesopotamian New Year festivals, particularly the Akitu celebration in Babylon, included ritual reenactments of divine assemblies where the Anunnaki gathered to determine fates for the coming year. Cuneiform texts describing these ceremonies reveal that fate determination involved complex bureaucratic procedures including presentation of evidence, deliberation among divine council members, and formal pronouncement of judgments. The Akitu festival occurred annually during the first 12 days of the month Nisanu, corresponding to March or April in modern calendars, and marked the renewal of cosmic order and royal authority. The festival's elaborate rituals brought together religious, political, and agricultural symbolism in ceremonies that simultaneously celebrated creation, confirmed royal legitimacy, and ensured prosperity for the coming agricultural cycle. The Anunnaki's role in fate determination rituals positioned them at the center of these cosmic renewal ceremonies. The ritual texts describe how on the 8th day of the Akitu festival, the Anunnaki Assembly convened to determine fates for the coming year. The ceremony took place in a special chamber called the Ubshukinna, literally meaning Chamber of Destinies, located within the temple complex of Marduk in Babylon. This architectural space provided the earthly setting where divine assembly proceedings could be ritually reenacted, with priests performing the roles of various gods and speaking the liturgical formulas that actualized the fate determination process. The physical structure of the Ubshukinna chamber included elevated platforms where the Anunnaki representatives sat in council, a central throne for Marduk as presiding deity, and spaces for presenting offerings and evidence relevant to the deliberations. The ritual procedures followed formal protocols beginning with purification ceremonies that prepared the sacred space for divine assembly. Priests burned incense, sprinkled holy water, and recited invocations that called the Anunnaki to convene in the chamber. The texts describe how each Anunnaki member was invoked by name and invited to take their designated seat, establishing the full assembly necessary for legitimate fate determination. Once the council convened, the presiding deity, represented by the chief priest assuming Marduk's role, presented the evidence requiring deliberation, including reports on the previous year's outcomes, assessments of natural phenomena, evaluations of royal performance, and projections regarding coming challenges. This evidence presentation employed actual administrative reports from throughout the Babylonian Empire, integrating real governance data into the theological framework. The deliberation process involved formal debate among assembly members representing different Anunnaki perspectives, with priests voicing the positions various gods might advocate regarding the fates under consideration. These ritual debates addressed practical questions including whether the coming year would bring abundance or scarcity, whether the king deserved continued divine support, whether foreign threats required military response, and whether natural disasters might occur requiring preventive ritual action. The scripted nature of these debates should not obscure their genuine deliberative function, as ritual participants made real decisions regarding resource allocation, policy direction, and religious priorities based on the evidence presented and the theological framework within which deliberations occurred. The fate determination culminated in formal pronouncements that were recorded in writing and proclaimed publicly, establishing the official destinies for the coming year. These pronouncements covered agricultural, expectations, political stability, royal authority, and cosmic order, essentially creating an annual administrative plan that guided governance throughout Babylon and its subject territories. The ritual concluded with the Anunnaki assembly, formally approving the determined fates and transferring authority to Marduk and the earthly king to implement these divine decrees. This transfer of authority from judicial assembly to executive implementation mirrored actual Babylonian governmental procedures, where council deliberations produced policy directives that royal administration then executed through bureaucratic mechanisms. Several Mesopotamian texts reference an inner council of 7 Anunnaki who held supreme judicial authority. The Gilgamesh Epic mentions these 7 judges by name in some versions, while other texts simply refer to the 7 who decree fate. This executive council appears to have functioned as the highest court in the cosmic legal system. The number 7 held profound symbolic significance throughout Mesopotamian culture, representing completeness and cosmic totality, while also appearing in numerous ritual and architectural contexts, including the 7-gated underworld, 7-tiered ziggurats, and 7-day weeks. The consistent identification of exactly 7 supreme Anunnaki judges across multiple independent textual sources demonstrates that this represented a fixed institutional structure rather than variable mythological invention. The 7-member configuration enabled efficient deliberation while ensuring diverse perspective representation, creating a council large enough to prevent individual bias, yet small enough to reach decisions without unwieldy procedural complications. The Descent of Inanna explicitly describes the 7 Anunnaki of the Underworld who pass judgment on Inanna when she enters their domain, sentencing her to death with their collective gaze. This passage establishes the 7 as operating in concert rather than as individuals, with their unanimous judgment required for binding verdicts. The text employs formulaic language describing how the 7 judges sat before Ereshkigal and fastened their eyes upon Inanna, the eyes of death, suggesting that execution of judgment required all 7 members participating in coordinated action. This collective judgment procedure prevented arbitrary individual decisions and ensured that capital sentences received thorough consideration by the full council. The requirement for unanimity in death sentences reflects sophisticated jurisprudential thinking regarding the gravity of irreversible punishments. The Era Epic, a late Babylonian composition dating to approximately 800 BC, provides additional detail about the 7 supreme Anunnaki by describing them as advisors to Era, the god of plague and warfare. The text portrays these 7 as counselors who deliberated regarding appropriate divine responses to human misconduct, weighing evidence of violations against cosmic law to determine whether punishment was warranted. Their advisory function positioned them as experts in jurisprudence who possessed comprehensive knowledge of precedent and cosmic statute, qualifying them to render authoritative interpretations of complex legal questions. The epic describes how Era convened the 7 to deliberate regarding whether humanity deserved destruction for their offences, with different council members presenting arguments for mercy or severity based on their assessment of evidence. Temple administrative texts from Babylon describe offerings presented specifically to the 7 Anunnaki judges, indicating that priests recognized these beings as distinct from the broader Anunnaki collective and worthy of special cultic attention. Tablet catalogued as British Museum No. 78942 prescribes daily offerings of bread, beer, meat, and incense to be presented to the 7 judges of the underworld, specifying quantities for each offering type and timing for presentations. The regular provision of offerings demonstrates that the 7 held permanent institutional positions, requiring ongoing support rather than convening only occasionally for special proceedings. The offering lists also reveal that priests understood these beings as possessing physical requirements similar to embodied deities, rather than as abstract theological concepts, reinforcing their characterization as actual divine administrators within Mesopotamian cosmology. Royal inscriptions occasionally reference the 7 supreme Anunnaki as witnesses to oaths and guarantors of treaty obligations, invoking their judicial authority to enforce international agreements and legitimate royal claims. The treaty between the Hittite king Muwatalli II and the Assyrian king Adad-nirari I, dating to approximately 1300 BC, invokes the 7 great Anunnaki among the divine witnesses who would punish treaty violations. This invocation positioned the 7 as cosmic enforcers whose authority transcended political boundaries and whose judgments would inevitably punish oath breakers regardless of earthly power or protection. The treaty's reliance on divine enforcement mechanisms reveals that ancient Near Eastern diplomacy understood cosmic law as providing the ultimate sanction for international obligations that earthly powers might otherwise violate with impunity. Scholarly analysis of god lists and theological commentaries has attempted to identify which specific deities comprise the 7 supreme Anunnaki, though textual evidence provides somewhat contradictory information. Some sources suggest the 7 included Enlil, Ninlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nanna, Utu, and Inanna, representing the major cosmic domains and natural forces. Other texts propose different compositions, including underworld deities like Nergal and Ereshkigal among the 7. This variation may reflect different theological traditions from various cities and periods, or it might indicate that the 7 represented institutional positions that different deities could occupy, rather than fixed individual identities. The emphasis in most texts falls on the number 7 and the collective judicial function rather than on specific personal identities, suggesting that Mesopotamian theology prioritized institutional structure over individual membership. Mesopotamian kings consistently invoked Anunnaki authority to legitimize their rule, claiming that the divine assembly had decreed their kingship and sanctioned their conquests. Royal inscriptions from the Sumerian 3rd dynasty of Ur through the Neo-Babylonian period regularly attribute military victories and administrative reforms to Anunnaki decrees. This ideological deployment of Anunnaki authority served crucial political functions by grounding royal power in cosmic law, rather than mere military force or dynastic succession. Kings who claimed Anunnaki sanction for their rule positioned themselves as executors of divine will rather than as usurpers or tyrants, transforming potentially controversial political actions into manifestations of cosmic order. The consistency of this legitimation strategy across different dynasties, ethnic groups, and political systems demonstrates that Mesopotamian political culture recognized Anunnaki authority as the supreme source of governmental legitimacy. The royal inscriptions of Ur-Nammu, founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, who ruled from approximately 2112 to 2095 BC, provide early examples of this legitimation ideology. Ur-Nammu's foundation inscriptions describe how the great Anunnaki determined his fate for kingship, establishing his rule as manifestation of divine decree rather than personal ambition or military conquest. The king's famous law code, one of the earliest comprehensive legal collections known to history, claims derivation from Anunnaki principles of justice, presenting the laws as codification of cosmic order rather than as royal invention. This attribution of legislative authority to divine sources positioned the law code as binding on all members of society, including the king himself, establishing the principle that legitimate authority operates within legal constraints, rather than through arbitrary personal power. The royal hymns of Shulgi, Ur-Nammu's son and successor, who ruled from approximately 2094 to 2047 BC, elaborate the connection between kingship and Anunnaki authority through extensive descriptions of divine designation ceremonies. These hymns describe how the Anunnaki assembly convened to evaluate potential rulers and selected Shulgi based on his superior qualifications and divine favour. The texts employ legal terminology describing the assembly's deliberation process, presentation of evidence regarding candidates' fitness for rule, and formal pronouncement of the judgment appointing Shulgi to kingship. The detailed procedural descriptions reinforce the portrayal of Anunnaki selection as legitimate judicial process rather than arbitrary divine whim, creating ideological foundation for accepting Shulgi's authority as manifestation of cosmic law. Later Babylonian kings continued this legitimation tradition, with particular emphasis during periods of political instability or contested succession. Hammurabi, who ruled Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BC, claimed in the prologue to his famous law code that Anu and Enlil called him to promote the welfare of the people, and that the great Anunnaki designated him to establish justice in the land. This divine mandate justified both Hammurabi's military conquests that unified Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule, and his comprehensive legal reforms that standardized law codes across previously independent city-states. The attribution of both conquest and legislation to Anunnaki decree transformed potentially controversial imperial expansion into fulfillment of divine purpose, reducing ideological resistance to Babylonian hegemony. The Neo-Assyrian kings of the first millennium BC developed particularly elaborate legitimation ideologies, invoking Anunnaki authority to justify their aggressive imperial expansion. The royal inscriptions of Sennacherib, who ruled from 705 to 681 BC, describe how the great gods and all the Anunnaki granted him supremacy over the four quarters of the world and decreed victory over his enemies. These inscriptions accompanied detailed annals documenting military campaigns, deportations of conquered populations, and extraction of tribute from subject peoples, actions that required robust ideological justification to maintain internal legitimacy and discourage rebellion. The invocation of Anunnaki decrees transformed brutal imperial policies into manifestations of cosmic order, presenting resistance to Assyrian rule as impious rebellion against divine will rather than as legitimate political opposition. Royal building inscriptions consistently attributed major construction projects to Anunnaki authorization, claiming that temple renovations, palace expansions, and infrastructure developments fulfilled divine mandates. Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled Babylon from 605 to 562 BC, inscribed his building projects with formulaic statements describing how the great Anunnaki commanded him to restore the temples and strengthen the city walls. These inscriptions appeared on foundation deposits, baked bricks incorporated into structure walls, and clay cylinders buried within building foundations, ensuring that claims of divine authorization would persist, even if the buildings themselves eventually deteriorated. The widespread distribution of these inscribed materials throughout Mesopotamia disseminated the ideological message that royal construction fulfilled cosmic mandates rather than serving personal aggrandizement. The consistency of Anunnaki invocation across different political contexts demonstrates that this legitimation strategy enjoyed broad cultural acceptance throughout Mesopotamian civilization. Kings from diverse ethnic backgrounds including Sumerians, Akkadians, Amorites, Kassites, and Chaldeans all employed similar ideological formulas attributing their authority to Anunnaki decrees. This cross-cultural consistency indicates that the concept resonated with fundamental Mesopotamian political assumptions regarding the cosmic sources of legitimate authority. The persistence of this legitimation pattern across nearly 2 millennia of political development reveals the stability of core Mesopotamian political theology, despite dramatic changes in specific governmental structures and ruling dynasties. Comprehensive god lists preserved on cuneiform tablets from various Mesopotamian cities provide detailed genealogies placing the Anunnaki within the broader divine hierarchy. The most extensive of these lists, known to scholars as Inanna, catalogues thousands of divine names organized by family relationships and administrative functions. These systematic theological compilations represent sophisticated attempts by Mesopotamian scribes to organize comprehensive knowledge of divine beings into coherent hierarchical frameworks. The god lists functioned simultaneously as reference works for ritual practitioners who needed accurate information about divine identities and relationships, as educational texts for training scribes in theological knowledge, and as scholarly exercises demonstrating scribal erudition through mastery of complex divine genealogies. The preservation of multiple copies from different cities and periods indicates that these lists enjoyed canonical status as authoritative references for proper divine nomenclature and hierarchical organization. The An God list, named for its opening entries beginning with the supreme god An and his consort Anum, survives in fragmentary copies from numerous Mesopotamian sites including Assur, Babylon, Nineveh, and Uruk. The most complete version comprises approximately 2,000 entries, organized into tablets covering different divine families and functional categories. Assyriologists have reconstructed approximately 70% of the complete list through comparison of fragmentary tablets and identification of standardized organizational patterns. The list's systematic arrangement reveals sophisticated taxonomic thinking as scribes grouped deities according to multiple overlapping criteria, including genealogical descent, geographical association, functional specialization, and administrative hierarchy. The Anunnaki appear throughout the list not as a single unified entry, but as a category designation applied to numerous individual deities who held specific positions within the divine bureaucracy. The god list identifies the Anunnaki as offspring of An, the sky god who headed the Sumerian pantheon, establishing their genealogical foundation within the divine family tree. Specific entries enumerate individual Anunnaki members by name, providing parentage information, spouse identifications, and references to associated cult centers where each deity received worship. The list includes notations indicating which Anunnaki held positions in the Underworld Judicial Assembly, which served in celestial administrative roles, and which supervised terrestrial domains. This detailed organizational information demonstrates that Mesopotamian theologians understood the AN-NUNNA-KI as occupying numerous specialized positions within a complex divine administration, rather than functioning as undifferentiated collective. The systematic organization of divine genealogies in the god lists reveals that Mesopotamian theology conceptualized the divine world as structured according to family relationships, analogous to human kinship systems. The Anunnaki descended from An through various divine mothers, creating multiple lineages that branch through successive generations. The lists carefully track these genealogical connections, identifying full siblings, half-siblings, and more distant relatives within the expanding divine family. This genealogical precision served practical ritual purposes as priests needed accurate information about divine family relationships to conduct ceremonies appropriately and avoid offending deities through improper precedence or inadequate recognition. The theological implication positioned the Anunnaki as legitimate participants in cosmic governance based on their noble genealogical descent rather than as usurpers or external intruders. Comparative analysis of god lists from different cities reveals local variations in divine hierarchies that reflect regional cultic preferences while maintaining overall structural consistency. The Nippur tradition emphasized Enlil and his family, positioning Enlil-descended Anunnaki in prominent positions within the hierarchical listings. The Babylon tradition elevated Marduk and reorganized divine hierarchies to reflect Marduk's supreme authority, adjusting Anunnaki positions to acknowledge Babylonian theological priorities. The Uruk tradition focused on An and Inanna, structuring its god lists around these deities and their associated divine families. Despite these local variations, the fundamental characterization of the Anunnaki as divine nobility, descended from An, remained consistent across all regional traditions. The god lists also preserved alternative names and epithets for Anunnaki members, documenting the multiple designations by which individual deities were known in different contexts and locations. These alternative nomenclatures created complex referential systems, requiring expert knowledge to navigate successfully. Scribal training in god list mastery represented advanced theological education that qualified priests for senior positions within temple hierarchies. The intellectual investment in maintaining and transmitting these comprehensive divine catalogues demonstrates that Mesopotamian civilization valued systematic theological knowledge and recognized the practical importance of accurate information about divine identities and relationships. Temple ritual texts discovered at sites including Uruk, Nippur, and Babylon preserve standardized invocations addressed to the Anunnaki collective. These liturgical formulas reveal how priests understood and engaged with these beings in daily religious practice. The ritual texts prescribe specific ceremonies for various occasions, including daily offerings, monthly festivals, annual celebrations, and special occasions requiring divine intervention or blessing. The standardization of these invocations across different temple centers indicates that Mesopotamian religious institutions maintained consistent liturgical protocols for Anunnaki worship, despite local variations in specific cult practices. The formulaic nature of the invocations reflects understanding that divine human communication required precise verbal formulas and proper ceremonial procedures rather than spontaneous personal expression. The daily offering rituals described in texts from the Anu temple at Uruk include morning and evening invocations addressed to the great Anunnaki, requesting their favorable judgment and blessing upon the temple, city, and worshippers. The ritual prescriptions specify the exact wording of these invocations, the postures priests should adopt while reciting them, the timing relative to sunrise and sunset, and the accompanying offerings of bread, beer, meat, and incense. The precision of these instructions demonstrates that priests understood ritual efficacy as depending on exact replication of established protocols, rather than on personal piety or emotional sincerity. The invocations employ honorific titles acknowledging the Anunnaki's judicial authority and cosmic administrative functions while requesting favorable exercise of that authority toward human petitioners. The monthly rituals conducted during the new moon and full moon celebrations included more elaborate Anunnaki invocations that acknowledged the assembly's role in fate determination and requested favorable destinies for the coming month. Texts from Babylon describe ceremonies where priests presented detailed accounts of temple activities, economic production, and social conditions to the Anunnaki, essentially providing administrative reports to divine supervisors. These ritual reports transformed religious ceremony into bureaucratic communication, treating the Anunnaki as cosmic administrators requiring regular updates on earthly conditions. The ritual structure mirrored the administrative procedures through which provincial governors reported to royal courts, projecting earthly governmental practices onto divine human relations. The annual Akitu festival included the most elaborate Anunnaki invocations as part of the fate determination ceremonies previously discussed. The ritual texts preserve the complete liturgy for these assemblies, including opening invocations that summoned the Anunnaki to convene, procedural formulas that structured the deliberative process, and closing benedictions that dismissed the assembly after fates had been determined. The linguistic precision of these formulas reveals sophisticated understanding of ritual speech as performative language that accomplished concrete results rather than merely describing or requesting divine action. The proper recitation of invocations in correct sequence with appropriate timing and accompanying gestures actualize the divine assembly, bringing cosmic processes into earthly manifestation through ritual performance. The invocation formulas frequently employed parallel grammatical structures and repetitive phrasing that created rhythmic patterns, facilitating memorization and oral transmission. This oral formulaic composition technique allowed priests to master extensive liturgical repertoires without requiring written reference during ritual performance. The poetic structure also enhanced ritual efficacy by creating aesthetic experiences that engage participants emotionally and psychologically, transforming bureaucratic divine administration into emotionally resonant religious experience. The combination of precise administrative language with poetic expression created liturgical formulas that simultaneously communicated specific information and evoked appropriate religious attitudes. Both the Sumerian flood story featuring Ziusudra and the later Babylonian versions starring Atrahasis and Utnapishtim describe the decision to send the deluge as emerging from Anunnaki council deliberations. The texts present complex divine politics, where different gods advocated opposing positions regarding humanity's destruction. The flood narratives represent some of the most widely known Mesopotamian literary compositions, preserved in numerous copies from various periods, and incorporated into broader epic cycles, including the Gilgamesh tradition. The consistency of Anunnaki portrayal across these different versions demonstrates that their role as divine council members who deliberated regarding humanity's fate represented stable theological tradition rather than the innovation of individual authors. The flood accounts provide crucial evidence for understanding how Mesopotamians conceived divine decision-making processes and the relationship between divine authority and cosmic justice. The Sumerian flood story, preserved on tablet CBS 10673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes how the great gods, including An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag, convened in assembly to deliberate regarding humanity's fate. The text indicates that human noise and overpopulation had disturbed divine rest, prompting Enlil to propose humanity's complete destruction through catastrophic flood. The council deliberated. This proposal, with different gods advocating various positions based on their assessments of human conduct and the justice of proposed punishment. Enki opposed the plan, arguing that humanity deserved warning and that total destruction represented excessive response to the offence. The assembly debate reveals sophisticated theological thinking regarding proportionality in divine punishment and the ethical limits of cosmic authority. The Atrahasis Epic preserves the most detailed account of the Divine Council's flood deliberations, describing how the Igigi's rebellion prompted the creation of humanity and how humanity's subsequent proliferation created new problems, requiring council intervention. The text describes a sequence of divine attempts to control human population through plague, drought, and famine, each initiated by Enlil and each frustrated by Enki's covert assistance to humanity. After these graduated responses failed to achieve satisfactory population reduction, Enlil convened the Anunnaki assembly to propose the ultimate solution of complete human extinction through catastrophic flood. The council deliberated this proposal extensively, with the text recording speeches from multiple divine perspectives regarding the justice and necessity of such extreme measures. The assembly debate reveals fundamental disagreement regarding humanity's value and the proportionality of proposed punishment. Enlil argued that humanity had violated their fundamental purpose by becoming too numerous and noisy, disturbing divine rest and consuming resources beyond sustainable levels. His position characterized humans as failed experiments, whose destruction would simply eliminate defective products and allow divine peace to resume. Enki countered that humanity performed valuable services maintaining cosmic infrastructure, and that their growing numbers represented success rather than failure. He proposed alternative solutions including education in birth control and redistribution of population to reduce density in problematic areas. The theological sophistication of this debate demonstrates Mesopotamian capacity for conceptualizing ethical complexity within divine governance rather than presenting the gods as arbitrary or capricious. The final vote resulted in the council approving Enlil's flood proposal despite Enki's opposition, establishing the principle that divine assemblies operated through majority decision rather than requiring unanimity. However, Enki's dissent created theological foundation for his subsequent actions, warning Atrahasis about the coming disaster and providing instructions for building a survival vessel. The text presents Enki's intervention not as rebellion against legitimate authority, but as principled dissent within constitutional bounds, distinguishing between obedience to council decisions and prohibition of individual conscience. This nuanced portrayal of divine politics reflects sophisticated understanding of governmental legitimacy requiring both institutional authority and ethical constraint. The Gilgamesh epic's flood account, narrated by Utnapishtim to Gilgamesh, provides additional details about the Divine Council's deliberations and the aftermath of flood implementation. Utnapishtim describes how the gods, after sending the deluge, immediately regretted their decision when witnessing humanity's complete destruction. The Divine Assembly reconvened in emergency session to address the catastrophe they had authorized, with several gods expressing horror at the devastation and questioning the wisdom of their previous decision. Ishtar lamented that she had supported the flood proposal without fully considering its consequences, while other gods criticized Enlil for advocating excessive punishment. This self-critical divine deliberation demonstrates theological willingness to acknowledge divine error and revise policies based on observed outcomes rather than defending previous decisions, regardless of consequences. The flood narratives consistently portray the AN-NUNNA-KI as collective decision-makers, whose authority derived from institutional position rather than personal power, whose decisions affected cosmic order rather than merely expressing individual preferences, and whose deliberations followed recognizable procedural norms similar to human governmental assemblies. The text presents divine governance as operating through debate, voting, and implementation of majority decisions while acknowledging the legitimacy of dissent and the possibility of policy revision based on experience. This constitutional understanding of divine authority profoundly influenced Mesopotamian political thought by establishing precedent for conceptualizing legitimate governance as requiring consultation, deliberation, and adherence to procedural norms, rather than resting solely on personal authority or military force. While the Anunnaki held primarily chthonic functions in Sumerian, theology, Babylonian astronomical texts developed complex correspondences between divine beings and celestial bodies. Some late-period texts associate specific Anunnaki with stars or planets, though these associations remained secondary to their juridical roles. The development of astral theology during the first millennium BC represented significant theological innovation that integrated earlier divine hierarchies with sophisticated astronomical knowledge accumulated through centuries of systematic celestial observation. Babylonian astronomers achieved unprecedented precision in tracking planetary movements, predicting eclipses, and calculating celestial cycles, creating vast databases of astronomical information that required theological interpretation. The correlation of divine beings with celestial phenomena provided framework for understanding how cosmic events related to earthly affairs and divine governance. The astronomical text known as Mulapin, compiled around 700 BC but incorporating earlier observational data, organizes the night sky into 3 celestial paths designated as the Path of Anu, the Path of Enlil, and the Path of Enki. These divisions structured Babylonian celestial geography by associating different regions of the sky with different divine authorities. The Path of Anu encompassed the celestial equatorial zone, the Path of Enlil covered the northern celestial hemisphere, and the Path of Enki spanned the southern sky. The Anunnaki appear in astronomical contexts as divine administrators associated with these celestial regions, though the texts remain somewhat ambiguous regarding whether individual Anunnaki corresponded to specific stars or whether the collective Anunnaki presence extended throughout the celestial sphere. Some astronomical commentaries identify the Pleiades star cluster as the assembly place of the great gods, including the Anunnaki, suggesting that this prominent asterism served as celestial throne room where divine councils convened. The Pleiades' heliacal rising in spring coincided with the Akitu New Year festival, when the Anunnaki assembled to determine fates, creating calendrical correlation between celestial and ritual events. This astronomical association integrated observational astronomy with theological concepts, allowing priests to identify optimal timing for rituals based on stellar positions, while understanding those same celestial phenomena as manifestations of divine assembly activities. The integration of astronomy and theology created comprehensive worldview in which celestial, divine, and earthly realms operated according to coordinated principles. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dating to approximately 1600 BC, preserves systematic observations of Venus appearances and disappearances, correlated with predictions of political and agricultural outcomes. The text describes how the appearance of Venus in specific celestial positions indicated favourable or unfavourable divine decrees regarding earthly affairs. While the tablet does not explicitly identify Venus with specific Anunnaki members, later commentaries developed correspondences between planetary deities and the Anunnaki assembly, suggesting that planetary movements manifested the assembly's deliberations and decisions. This interpretive framework transformed astronomical observation into theological inquiry, with planetary positions providing evidence of divine council activities and decisions. The astrolabe texts, circular astronomical diagrams dividing the sky into 12 monthly segments, assign various stars and constellations to divine supervision, including several associated with Anunnaki functions. These diagrams served as reference tools for priests conducting astronomical observations and interpreting celestial omens. The assignment of celestial regions to specific divine administrators created comprehensive cosmic geography in which every portion of the heavens fell under designated divine jurisdiction. The Anunnaki's inclusion in these celestial administrative schemes extended their authority beyond the underworld to encompass cosmic totality, though texts consistently maintained that their primary functions remained juridical rather than astronomical. The development of astral theology during the Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods produced increasingly elaborate correspondences between divine beings and celestial phenomena, sometimes identifying individual Anunnaki with specific stars or constellations. However, these late theological developments never displaced the fundamental understanding of Anunnaki as judges and administrators. the astronomical associations supplemented rather than replaced their juridical functions, adding celestial dimensions to beings whose primary identity remained rooted in underworld governance. The theological synthesis integrated observation-based astronomy with traditional religious concepts, creating sophisticated, cosmological systems that explained celestial phenomena through divine agency while maintaining consistency with established theological frameworks. Mesopotamian cosmology understood creation as an ongoing process, requiring constant divine maintenance against the ever-present threat of chaos. The AN-NUNNA-KI functioned as cosmic border guards, maintaining the boundary between the ordered realm of civilization and the chaotic forces that continually threatened to overwhelm it. The Mesopotamian creation accounts describe how the ordered cosmos emerged from primordial chaos through Marduk's victory over Tiamat, but this initial creation did not permanently eliminate chaotic forces. Instead, chaos remained as constant presence at the margins of ordered reality, requiring continuous divine effort to prevent its resurgence. The Anunnaki's role in maintaining cosmic boundaries positioned them as essential administrators whose ongoing work preserved the fragile order separating civilization from primordial disorder. The concept of cosmic boundaries appears throughout Mesopotamian religious literature in multiple forms, including geographical boundaries separating civilized lands from chaotic wilderness, temporal boundaries distinguishing ordered time from primordial past and apocalyptic future, and ontological boundaries differentiating living from dead and divine from mortal. The Anunnaki supervised all these boundary zones, functioning as cosmic immigration officers who controlled transitions between different states of existence. Their underworld jurisdiction placed them at the fundamental boundary between life and death, where they determined which souls crossed successfully and which faced rejection or punishment. Their role in fate determination involved establishing temporal boundaries, defining the duration of individual lives, royal reigns, and civilizational epochs. The Era epic describes threats to cosmic order arising when the God Era, representing plague, and chaos attempted to disrupt the established boundaries, maintaining civilizational stability. The text portrays the Anunnaki as defenders of cosmic order, who opposed Era's destructive initiatives and worked to restore proper boundaries after his rampage caused temporary collapse of civilizational structures. The narrative emphasizes that chaos constantly threatens to overwhelm order, and that divine vigilance remains essential to preserve the fragile stability enabling human civilization. The Anunnaki appear as the primary agents of this defensive vigilance, cosmic sentries whose constant monitoring prevents chaos from penetrating the ordered realm. The ritual texts describe regular ceremonies reinforcing cosmic boundaries through symbolic actions and invocations that reaffirm divine authority over chaotic forces. The Akitu New Year festival included ritual combat between order and chaos, with priests enacting Marduk's victory over Tiamat to renew cosmic boundaries for another year. The Anunnaki participation in these ceremonies involved witnessing and validating the boundary renewal, essentially providing juridical certification that proper cosmic order had been re-established. Their presence transformed ritual enactment into legally binding cosmic contract that constrained chaotic forces for the contracted period. Temple architecture materialized cosmic boundaries through physical structures that separated sacred from profane space, creating ordered zones where divine presence could manifest without contamination from chaotic forces. The seven-gated structure of temple complexes replicated the seven-gated underworld, with each gate representing a boundary that souls or worshippers traversed in their journey toward divine presence. The Anunnaki associations with these architectural boundaries positioned them as guardians of thresholds who determined which beings could cross and under what conditions. Temple priests performing gatekeeper roles during rituals enacted Anunnaki functions, examining credentials and determining eligibility for admission to progressively more sacred spaces. The legal codes promulgated by Mesopotamian kings served similar boundary maintenance functions by establishing clear distinctions between acceptable and prohibited conduct, creating social order that prevented descent into chaotic violence. The attribution of these law codes to divine sources, including Anunnaki authority, positioned legal boundaries as cosmic principles rather than arbitrary human inventions. Violations of law constituted breaches of cosmic boundaries that threatened to allow chaos to penetrate ordered society, requiring judicial intervention to repair the breach and restore proper boundaries. The Anunnaki's role as cosmic judges extended to earthly legal proceedings, with their ultimate authority providing foundation for human courts that implemented divine law in daily practice. The remarkable consistency of Anunnaki portrayal across Mesopotamian literature spanning from early dynastic Sumerian texts, around 2600 BC through Neo-Babylonian compositions, ending around 500 BC, demonstrates that this represented a stable theological concept rather than evolving speculation. The 2,000-year textual continuity provides compelling evidence that Mesopotamian civilization maintained consistent understanding of these beings' identity and function, despite dramatic political, cultural, and linguistic transformations that occurred across this vast chronological expanse. The stability of the Anunnaki concept contrasts sharply with other theological elements that underwent significant development and revision, suggesting that certain core beliefs enjoyed such fundamental acceptance that they remained essentially unchanged across millennia of religious development. The earliest textual references to the Anunnaki appear in early dynastic Sumerian inscriptions and literary compositions dating to approximately 2600 BC. These archaic texts already present the Anunnaki as established theological category, requiring no explanation or introduction, suggesting that the concept predated written documentation by unknown, but potentially substantial periods. The early dynastic references describe the Anunnaki in terms virtually identical to those employed in texts written 2,000 years later, including their collective nature, their judicial functions, their association with the underworld, and their role as cosmic administrators. This immediate textual maturity argues against theories proposing that the Anunnaki concept developed gradually from simpler origins, instead indicating that scribes recorded an already fully articulated theological framework. The transition from Sumerian to Akkadian as Mesopotamia's primary written language around 2000 BC created potential for theological transformation, as concepts expressed in Sumerian were translated into Semitic, linguistic, and cultural frameworks. However, the Akkadian translations of Sumerian religious texts preserved Anunnaki characterization with remarkable fidelity, maintaining the essential theological content while adapting superficial linguistic forms. The Old Babylonian period compositions, including Atrahasis and early Gilgamesh versions, continued portraying the Anunnaki exactly as Sumerian sources had described them, demonstrating that the concept successfully transferred across linguistic and cultural boundaries without fundamental alteration. The political fragmentation of Mesopotamia during the 2nd millennium BC, when rival kingdoms including Babylon, Assyria, Elam, and various smaller states competed for regional dominance, might have produced theological divergence as different political centers developed distinctive religious traditions supporting their particular interests. However, the Anunnaki concept remained consistent across these political divisions, with texts from Babylon, Assyria, and other centers describing these beings in essentially identical terms. This theological unity amid political fragmentation suggests that the Anunnaki concept enjoyed such fundamental acceptance that regional variations and political propaganda could not significantly modify it. The Neo-Assyrian period during the 1st millennium BC witnessed significant theological development, including the elevation of Ashur to supreme divine status in Assyrian tradition, and increased emphasis on astral theology correlating divine beings with celestial bodies. Despite these innovations, the fundamental characterization of the Anunnaki as underworld judges and cosmic administrators persisted unchanged. The Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions continued invoking Anunnaki authority using formulaic language essentially unchanged from Old Babylonian compositions written 1,000 years earlier. This theological conservatism regarding the Anunnaki contrasts with willingness to innovate in other theological domains, suggesting that certain core concepts resisted revision even when broader theological systems underwent substantial development. The Neo-Babylonian period, particularly during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II from 605 to 562 BC, witnessed deliberate archaising efforts as scribes consciously imitated earlier Sumerian and Old Babylonian literary styles. However, this archaising represented conscious preservation of traditional forms rather than innovation disguised as tradition. The Neo-Babylonian Anunnaki references employed genuinely ancient formulations that had remained in continuous use, demonstrating unbroken transmission of theological concepts across the intervening centuries. The scholarly tradition that preserved and copied earlier texts ensured that later generations had direct access to archaic, theological formulations, rather than receiving distorted versions filtered through multiple transformations. The persistence of the AN-NUNNA-KI concept through multiple foreign conquests, including the Kassite domination, during the 2nd millennium BC, the Assyrian imperial expansion, and the Persian conquest in 539 BC, demonstrates remarkable theological stability. Conquerors typically imposed their own religious traditions or at minimum syncretized indigenous beliefs with imported theology, yet the Anunnaki concept survived these political transitions essentially unchanged. The Persian period texts continue describing the Anunnaki in traditional terms despite Zoroastrian influence on other aspects of Mesopotamian religion, suggesting that this concept enjoyed such deep cultural roots that even foreign rulers recognized the futility of attempting to modify it. Ancient Near Eastern cultures beyond Mesopotamia developed similar concepts of divine councils that performed judicial and administrative functions. Ugaritic texts from Syria describe the assembly of El with 70 divine sons, while Hebrew Bible passages reference the divine council where Yahweh presides over celestial beings. These parallel developments provide comparative context for understanding the Anunnaki as manifestation of broader Near Eastern patterns of theological thought rather than as unique Mesopotamian invention. The widespread appearance of divine council concepts across different cultures suggests that ancient Near Eastern civilizations shared fundamental assumptions about the nature of cosmic governance and divine authority. Examining these parallel traditions illuminates common patterns while highlighting distinctive features that characterized each culture's particular theological development. The Ugaritic texts discovered at Ras Shamra in Syria beginning in 1929 preserve religious literature from the Late Bronze Age around 1400 to 1200 BC. These texts describe El, the supreme god of the Ugaritic pantheon, presiding over an assembly of 70 divine sons who deliberated regarding cosmic affairs and rendered judgments affecting both divine and mortal realms. The assembly met on a sacred mountain where El held court, receiving reports from subordinate deities and issuing decrees that governed natural phenomena and human political developments. The structural parallels with Mesopotamian divine council concepts, including hierarchical organization, deliberative procedures, and juridical functions, suggest that these traditions shared common ancient Near Eastern assumptions about divine governance. The Ugaritic divine assembly differed from the Mesopotamian Anunnaki in several significant respects, including the specific number of 70 members, the greater emphasis on familial relationships between El and his divine sons, and the integration of the assembly with Canaanite fertility theology. However, the fundamental concept of divine governance, operating through collective deliberation rather than through individual divine fiat, remained consistent across both traditions. The Ugaritic texts describe assembly debates regarding appropriate divine responses to human petitions, decisions about distributing cosmic responsibilities among various deities, and judgments resolving disputes between different divine factions. These deliberative processes closely parallel Mesopotamian descriptions of Anunnaki council proceedings, suggesting that both cultures conceptualize divine authority as institutional rather than personal. The Hebrew Bible preserves multiple references to the divine council, where Yahweh presides over celestial beings who serve as advisors, messengers, and administrators. The Book of Psalms describes Yahweh standing in the divine assembly and rendering judgment among the gods, while the Book of Job portrays the sons of God presenting themselves before Yahweh to report on their cosmic supervisory activities. These biblical references employ terminology and conceptual frameworks closely paralleling both Mesopotamian and Ugaritic divine council traditions, indicating that Israelite theology participated in broader ancient Near Eastern patterns of thought regarding divine governance. The biblical texts adapted these common patterns to monotheistic framework by subordinating all celestial beings to Yahweh's absolute authority, but the fundamental institutional structure remained recognizable. The Book of 1 Kings describes the prophet Micaiah experiencing a vision of Yahweh seated on his throne with all the host of heaven standing beside him, deliberating regarding how to accomplish a specific objective. The narrative portrays the divine council debating various proposals before reaching consensus on a course of action, demonstrating that even within monotheistic Israelite theology, divine decision-making involved consultation and deliberation, rather than simply expressing unilateral divine will. This biblical divine council operates according to principles similar to those governing AN-NUNNA-KI assemblies, including presentation of alternatives, collective deliberation, and formal authorization of chosen course of action. The common ancient Near Eastern pattern of divine councils performing judicial and administrative functions demonstrates that the Anunnaki concept represented regional theological framework rather than unique Mesopotamian innovation. The widespread distribution of similar concepts suggests that these ideas addressed fundamental questions about cosmic governance that concerned all ancient Near Eastern cultures. The variations between different cultural expressions of divine council theology reflect local theological preferences and distinctive religious developments while maintaining underlying structural commonalities. The Mesopotamian Anunnaki tradition represents the most fully documented and extensively developed version of this broader pattern, preserved in extraordinary textual detail through cuneiform sources spanning 2 millennia. Detailed examination of Anunnaki descriptions in cuneiform sources reveals complete absence of technological artifacts or material culture beyond what would be expected for divine beings in ancient theological imagination. The texts never describe spacecraft, advanced weapons, genetic engineering equipment, or any technological infrastructure. This absence stands in stark contrast to modern reinterpretations that project contemporary technological concepts onto ancient texts, reading spacecraft into descriptions of divine chariots or genetic manipulation into creation narratives. Careful philological analysis demonstrates that the cuneiform texts describe the AN-NUNNA-KI using conventional ancient Near Eastern theological language that refers to supernatural rather than technological capabilities. The divine vehicles mentioned in Mesopotamian texts employ standard terminology for chariots drawn by animals or mythological creatures, never describing propulsion systems, energy sources, or technological mechanisms. When texts describe gods travelling through the heavens, they use language of flying, soaring, or riding on clouds, employing metaphorical and mythological imagery rather than technical descriptions of mechanical apparatus. The Anzu myth describes a divine bird creature whose theft of the Tablet of Destinies disrupts cosmic order, but the text characterizes this being as a monster rather than as a vehicle or technological device. The imagery throughout remains firmly within conventional ancient Near Eastern mythological frameworks, without any indication of technological interpretation. The creation narratives describe divine beings fashioning humans from clay and divine blood through direct supernatural action, rather than through technological intervention or genetic engineering. The Atrahasis Epic provides the most detailed creation account, describing how the goddess Nintu mixed clay with the blood of a slain god while reciting incantations, then shaped 14 pieces of clay that gestated into the first humans. The process described relies entirely on supernatural divine action, without any reference to laboratory equipment, scientific procedures, or technological apparatus. The language employed belongs firmly to ancient Near Eastern mythological and magical traditions, describing ritual actions and incantations rather than technical procedures. Modern attempts to reinterpret this creation narrative as describing genetic engineering require importing contemporary concepts entirely absent from the actual cuneiform texts. The Anunnaki themselves are described using conventional theological terminology, denoting divine beings with supernatural rather than technological capabilities. They possess the ability to determine fates, render judgments, and travel between cosmic realms. But these abilities are consistently portrayed as inherent divine attributes, rather than as technologies requiring equipment or apparatus. The texts describe the Anunnaki as gods, not as technologically advanced aliens, employing Sumerian and Akkadian terminology with well-established theological meanings. The word for god in Sumerian, Dingir, and its Akkadian equivalent, Ilu, denotes supernatural beings fundamentally different in nature from humans rather than merely more technologically advanced versions of humanity. The absence of technological vocabulary throughout the extensive Anunnaki textual corpus becomes particularly significant when compared to the detailed technical terminology Mesopotamian texts employ when describing actual technologies. Cuneiform sources contain precise technical language for irrigation systems, architectural construction, metallurgical processes, textile production, and agricultural techniques. Scribes demonstrated capacity for detailed technical description when documenting actual technologies, employing specific terminology for tools, materials, and procedures. The complete absence of similar technical, Language and Anunnaki descriptions argue strongly that these texts describe theological rather than technological concepts. The material culture associated with Anunnaki worship consisted of conventional ancient Near Eastern religious artifacts, including temples, altars, cult statues, offering vessels, and ritual implements. Archaeological excavations of Mesopotamian religious sites have recovered thousands of these artifacts, all conforming to expected ancient material culture without any anomalous technological objects. The cult statues representing various deities, including Anunnaki members, were carved from wood or stone using conventional ancient sculptural techniques, not manufactured through advanced technological processes. The temples where Anunnaki received worship were constructed using mud brick, baked brick, and stone masonry according to documented ancient architectural methods without evidence of advanced construction technologies. The offerings presented to the Anunnaki consisted of bread, beer, meat, incense, and other conventional ancient foodstuffs and ritual materials. The ritual texts prescribe specific quantities and types of offerings, using standard Mesopotamian measurement units and ingredient lists that reflect actual agricultural production and food preparation practices. No texts describe the Anunnaki requiring exotic materials, unusual energy sources, or technological components as offerings. The conventional nature of cult requirements demonstrates that priests understood the Anunnaki as deities with supernatural rather than technological needs. Mesopotamian underworld literature, including the Descent of Inanna and the Gilgamesh dream visions, provides detailed geographical descriptions of the realm where Anunnaki held court. These descriptions employ consistent topographical features including 7 gates, various rivers, and architectural structures that parallel above-ground Mesopotamian temple complexes. The underworld geography, described in these texts, creates a coherent spatial framework that remained remarkably stable across different compositions and historical periods, suggesting that Mesopotamian scribes conceived the realm of the dead according to systematic cosmological principles rather than through vague mythological speculation. The detailed consistency of these geographical descriptions indicates that Mesopotamian theology understood the underworld as a real location with specific physical characteristics, organized according to principles that reflected and inverted the geography of the living world. The Descent of Inanna provides the most detailed description of the underworld's physical layout, describing how Inanna passed through 7 successive gates on her journey to confront her sister Ereshkigal. Each gate required surrender of specific items of clothing or adornment, systematically stripping away Inanna's divine powers and earthly status until she arrived naked before the underworld throne. The text identifies each gate by name and describes the gatekeeper who controlled passage, creating a structured administrative hierarchy that governed access to progressively deeper levels of the underworld. The 7-gate structure appears consistently across multiple underworld narratives, establishing it as a fundamental architectural feature rather than an incidental detail specific to individual compositions. The numerical significance of 7 gates connects underworld geography to broader Mesopotamian symbolic systems in which 7 represented cosmic totality and completeness. The 7-tiered ziggurats that dominated Mesopotamian cityscapes materialize this cosmological principle in architectural form, with each level representing a distinct cosmic realm. The 7 gates of the underworld created an inverse parallel to the ziggurat's ascending tiers, with each gate marking descent into progressively deeper levels of the realm of the dead. This architectural symbolism integrated underworld geography into comprehensive cosmological frameworks that unified celestial, terrestrial, and chthonic realms within coherent spatial systems. The rivers that flowed through the underworld realm created additional geographical features mentioned in various texts. The Huber River appears most frequently, described as a waterway that souls crossed on their journey to the land of no return. Some texts mention ferryman figures who transported the dead across these waters, while others describe souls wading through rivers that tested their worthiness through ordeal. The underworld rivers paralleled the Tigris and Euphrates that defined Mesopotamian geography in the world above, creating mirror cosmology in which the realm of the dead replicated terrestrial geography in inverted or distorted form. The architectural structures within the underworld included palaces, temples, and administrative buildings that housed various divine officials, including the Anunnaki judges. The Descent of Inanna describes Ereshkigal's palace as containing a throne room where the 7 Anunnaki sat in assembly, architectural spaces for various underworld deities and their servants, and storage areas for the accoutrements of death and judgment. The palace architecture followed conventions familiar from above-ground Mesopotamian palace complexes, including multiple courtyards, audience halls, and private chambers organized according to hierarchical principles that regulated access based on rank and function. The Gilgamesh epic's descriptions of Enkidu's underworld dream vision provide additional geographical details, including the House of Dust where the dead dwelt in darkness, consuming clay and drinking muddy water as sustenance. This House of Dust appeared as a vast structure containing former kings, priests and nobles who had lost all earthly status and now served as menial labourers in the realm of the dead. The architectural imagery emphasized the permanence of death and the futility of earthly achievements, as even the most powerful rulers found themselves reduced to dust-eating shadows in the underworld's eternal gloom. The consistent geographical descriptions across multiple texts demonstrate that Mesopotamian theology conceived the underworld as a coherent location with systematic organization rather than as a vague mythological concept. The detailed architectural and topographical features indicate that scribes devoted serious intellectual effort to developing comprehensive underworld cosmology that integrated with broader theological frameworks. The Anunnaki's permanent residence within this carefully articulated realm reinforces their characterization as established divine administrators rather than as transient visitors or external beings. Cuneiform texts preserve complex genealogies connecting the Anunnaki to other divine beings through family relationships typical of Mesopotamian kinship systems. These genealogies demonstrate that scribes understood the Anunnaki as participants in divine family structures rather than external visitors. The extensive documentation of divine family trees reveals sophisticated theological thinking about how divine beings related to one another through kinship bonds similar to those structuring human society. The Anunnaki's integration into these genealogical networks positioned them as native members of the Mesopotamian pantheon, with established lineages tracing back to the primordial divine generations, rather than as newcomers or outsiders without proper genealogical credentials. The god lists previously discussed include extensive genealogical information, documenting parent-child relationships, sibling connections, and marriage alliances that structured the divine family. The Anunnaki appear throughout these genealogies as descendants of An and various divine mothers, creating multiple family lines that branch through successive generations. Individual Anunnaki members are identified with specific parents, establishing their position within the broader divine kinship network. The precision of these genealogical records demonstrates that Mesopotamian scribes devoted substantial intellectual effort to documenting divine family relationships, suggesting they understood these connections as theologically significant rather than as arbitrary mythological details. The marriage relationships documented in god lists and mythological narratives connected the Anunnaki to other divine lineages through spousal bonds that created a final kinship networks. Several texts describe marriages between Anunnaki members and deities from other divine families, creating alliance structures that paralleled the marriage politics through which human royal families secured political relationships. These divine marriage alliances produced offspring who inherited characteristics from both parental lineages, creating complex patterns of genealogical descent that integrated the Anunnaki into the comprehensive kinship network structuring the divine world. The sibling relationships among Anunnaki members created horizontal kinship bonds that complemented the vertical parent-child connections documented in genealogical lists. Texts identify full siblings who shared both parents, half-siblings who shared one parent, and more distant cousins descended from common ancestors in earlier generations. These sibling relationships affected divine politics as family loyalties influenced the positions various Anunnaki members advocated within council deliberations. The mythological narratives describe family conflicts where siblings supported opposing positions in divine disputes, reflecting the political complexity that kinship bonds introduced into cosmic governance. The generational depth of Anunnaki genealogies established their lineages as extending back to the earliest divine generations following the primordial creation. The god lists trace Anunnaki ancestry through multiple generations reaching back to the offspring of An-NUNNA-KI, the primordial sky and earth deities. This genealogical depth positioned the Anunnaki as members of divine nobility, with ancient and distinguished lineages rather than as recent arrivals or upstart deities. The emphasis on genealogical antiquity reflects Mesopotamian cultural values that accorded status and authority based on family lineage and ancestral heritage. The kinship terminology employed in cuneiform texts describing Anunnaki relationships uses standard Sumerian and Akkadian words for family relationships, including father, mother, son, daughter, brother, sister, husband, and wife. The consistent use of conventional kinship vocabulary reinforces that scribes conceive the Anunnaki according to familiar social categories, rather than as beings fundamentally different from other divine entities. The texts never employ special terminology suggesting that the Anunnaki represented a different category of being requiring unique kinship descriptors, instead integrating them fully into conventional divine family structures. The divine genealogies also documented inheritance of specific cosmic responsibilities and cult centers through family lines, with positions and jurisdictions passing from parent to child according to principles similar to those governing human inheritance practices. Several texts describe how particular Anunnaki members inherited their positions from parental predecessors, establishing continuity of divine administration across generations. This hereditary transmission of cosmic offices created stable administrative structures that persisted despite changes in individual office holders, ensuring institutional continuity within divine governance. Modern interpretation must grapple with the question of how ancient Mesopotamians themselves understood these texts. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals that educated scribes recognized distinctions between literal, history, didactic myth, and theological speculation. The cuneiform sources provide substantial evidence regarding ancient Mesopotamian epistemological frameworks and hermeneutical approaches to religious literature. Scribal commentaries, school texts, and administrative documents demonstrate that Mesopotamian intellectuals possessed sophisticated understanding of textual interpretation and recognized different genres of literature requiring different interpretive approaches. The evidence suggests that ancient readers did not interpret all religious texts as literal historical accounts, but recognized that different compositions served different purposes and employed different rhetorical strategies. The scribal school texts discovered at various Mesopotamian sites reveal the educational curriculum through which young scribes learned to read and write cuneiform. These educational materials included practice compositions, model letters, and literary excerpts that students copied, repeatedly to develop writing proficiency. The school texts demonstrate that scribal education included instruction in recognizing different literary genres and understanding the conventional features that distinguished historical chronicles from mythological narratives, from wisdom literature, from royal propaganda. This educational emphasis on genre recognition indicates that trained scribes possessed the intellectual tools necessary to interpret texts according to appropriate hermeneutical principles rather than reading all literature as undifferentiated literal truth. The commentaries and explanatory texts composed by Mesopotamian scholars provide direct evidence of ancient interpretive practices. These commentaries explain obscure passages in canonical texts, resolve apparent contradictions between different sources, and provide theological interpretations of mythological narratives. The commentaries demonstrate sophisticated hermeneutical awareness as ancient scholars distinguished between the plain meaning of texts and deeper theological or allegorical significance. Some commentaries explicitly identify mythological narratives as conveying theological truths through symbolic stories rather than as recording literal historical events, revealing that ancient interpreters recognized the distinction between symbolic and literal meaning. The historical chronicles composed during various periods of Mesopotamian history provide evidence for how scribes recorded events they understood as literal history. These chronicles employ distinctive literary features including precise dating formulas, administrative terminology, and documentation of specific individuals and events verifiable through archaeological evidence. The contrast between the literary style of historical chronicles and that of mythological compositions indicates that ancient authors recognized generic differences and employed different compositional strategies when recording historical events, versus composing theological narratives. The mythological texts describing the Anunnaki employ literary features characteristic of theological composition rather than historical documentation, suggesting that ancient authors distinguished these texts from literal historical records. The royal inscriptions provide additional evidence for ancient Mesopotamian understanding of historical versus mythological discourse. Kings regularly claimed divine support for their reigns, while simultaneously documenting specific military campaigns, building projects, and administrative reforms in language that presumed literal historical interpretation. The inscriptions distinguish between theological claims about divine authorization and historical claims about specific events, employing different rhetorical strategies for each type of claim. This generic distinction within single compositions demonstrates that ancient authors recognized differences between theological and historical discourse and expected readers to interpret each appropriately. The ritual texts prescribing ceremonies for various religious occasions reveal how priests enacted mythological narratives through ritual performance. The texts describe priests assuming the roles of various gods and reciting speeches attributed to those deities in mythological compositions. This ritual reenactment of mythology demonstrates that at least some ancient practitioners understood mythological narratives as providing scripts for ritual performance rather than as documenting historical events. The distinction between mythological narrative and ritual enactment suggests sophisticated understanding that religious texts could serve performative functions without necessarily claiming literal historical truth. Academic Assyriologists examining the primary cuneiform evidence have reached broad consensus regarding Anunnaki identity and function within Mesopotamian religious thought. This scholarly interpretation based on linguistic analysis, comparative theology, and contextual understanding differs dramatically from popular alternative theories. The academic consensus emerges from over a century of rigorous philological research, archaeological excavation, and scholarly debate that has established firm methodological principles for interpreting ancient texts. The Assyriological community comprises hundreds of specialists worldwide who read cuneiform languages fluently, study texts in their original form, and employ peer-reviewed research standards that ensure interpretive reliability. The consensus interpretation rests on massive evidential foundations that alternative theories typically ignore or misrepresent. The linguistic analysis supporting scholarly consensus begins with accurate translation of Sumerian and Akkadian texts using dictionaries compiled from thousands of cuneiform sources. The Chicago Assyrian Dictionary and the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary represent multi-decade collaborative projects that documented ancient Mesopotamian languages with unprecedented precision. These reference works enable scholars to translate cuneiform texts with confidence regarding word meanings, grammatical constructions, and idiomatic expressions. The term Anunnaki receives consistent translation across these authoritative references as denoting divine beings descended from An, with no linguistic evidence supporting alternative translations suggesting extraterrestrial origin or technological nature. The comparative theological analysis demonstrates that Anunnaki concepts fit coherently within broader ancient Near Eastern religious patterns. Scholars have identified numerous parallels between Mesopotamian divine council traditions and similar concepts in Ugaritic, Hebrew, and other regional religious literatures. These parallels reveal common cultural frameworks for understanding divine governance and cosmic administration that characterized ancient Near Eastern civilization broadly. The Anunnaki represent Mesopotamian instantiation of widespread regional patterns rather than unique anomalies requiring extraordinary explanations. The consistency of divine council concepts across multiple independent cultures argues for conventional religious interpretation rather than for theories proposing extraterrestrial intervention. The archaeological evidence supports scholarly interpretation through documentation of material culture associated with Anunnaki worship. Excavations throughout Mesopotamia have recovered temples, cult statues, offering vessels and ritual texts that demonstrate conventional ancient religious practices without any anomalous technological artifacts. The material remains conform entirely to expected patterns for ancient Near Eastern religion, showing no evidence of contact with advanced civilizations or possession of extraordinary technologies. The archaeological record contradicts alternative theories proposing that Anunnaki worship involved interaction with technologically advanced beings, as such interaction should have left material traces absent from the actual evidence. The contextual analysis examining how Anunnaki texts functioned within Mesopotamian society reveals their roles in legitimating political authority, structuring religious practice, and articulating cosmological frameworks. scholars have documented how kings invoked Anunnaki authority to justify their rule, how priests employed Anunnaki invocations in daily rituals, and how scribes integrated Anunnaki concepts into comprehensive theological systems. This functional analysis demonstrates that Anunnaki belief served conventional religious and political purposes without requiring extraordinary explanations. The texts make perfect sense when interpreted as ancient theology, addressing perennial human questions about cosmic order, divine justice, and legitimate authority. The scholarly consensus recognizes the Anunnaki as divine judges and administrators. Within Mesopotamian religious cosmology, beings who presided over the underworld determined human fates and maintained cosmic order according to established divine law. This interpretation accounts for all textual evidence without requiring speculative additions or tendentious rereadings of clear passages. The consensus represents the conclusion of specialists who have devoted careers to studying these sources in their original languages and cultural contexts, employing rigorous methodological standards that distinguish between evidence-based interpretation and imaginative speculation. The transformation of the Anunnaki from ancient divine judges into extraterrestrial genetic engineers represents a modern phenomenon beginning in the mid-20th century. Examining how and why this reinterpretation emerged reveals more about contemporary cultural anxieties and desires than about ancient Mesopotamian beliefs. The alternative interpretation originated not from new archaeological discoveries or improved textual analysis, but from speculative theories proposed by authors without specialized training in Assyriological research. The reinterpretation gained popular traction despite lacking scholarly support because it resonated with contemporary cultural fascinations including ancient astronaut theories, conspiratorial thinking about hidden history, and science fiction narratives about humanity's origins. The key figure in popularizing extraterrestrial interpretations of the Anunnaki was Zecharia Sitchin, whose books beginning with The 12th Planet, published in 1976, proposed that cuneiform texts described ancient astronauts who genetically engineered humanity. Sitchin claimed expertise in ancient languages, but lacked formal training in Assyriological methods and consistently mistranslated cuneiform texts to support his theories. Professional Assyriologists have demonstrated numerous fundamental errors in Sitchin's translations, showing that he misunderstood basic grammatical constructions, mistranslated common words, and imposed meanings on texts that contradict their plain sense in the original languages. Despite these documented errors, Sitchin's books achieved massive popular success, selling millions of copies and establishing an alternative interpretation that persists in popular culture despite scholarly refutation. The cultural context enabling Sitchin's success included widespread fascination with ancient astronaut theories, popularized by Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, published in 1968. Von Daniken argued that ancient monuments and mythological traditions worldwide provided evidence of extraterrestrial contact in humanity's distant past. This interpretive framework predisposed popular audiences to accept similar readings of Mesopotamian texts without critically examining the evidence. The ancient astronaut paradigm offered psychologically satisfying explanations for ancient achievements that seemed impressive relative to conventional assumptions about prehistoric capabilities, allowing modern audiences to resolve cognitive dissonance by attributing ancient accomplishments to extraterrestrial intervention. The reinterpretation also reflected contemporary anxieties about human origins and identity in an increasingly secularized culture. Traditional religious creation narratives had lost credibility for many educated people, but purely materialistic evolutionary accounts failed to satisfy desires for cosmic significance and purpose. The ancient astronaut narrative provided a middle ground that acknowledged scientific evolution while reintroducing elements of intentional creation and cosmic destiny. The reinterpreted Anunnaki served as substitute creators who designed humanity for specific purposes, providing modern audiences with origin narratives that combined scientific language with theological meaning. The persistence of alternative Anunnaki interpretations despite scholarly refutation reveals important dynamics in contemporary knowledge production and authority. The internet and self-publishing technologies have democratized information distribution, enabling alternative theories to reach mass audiences without passing through academic peer review or editorial quality control. Popular presentations often possess greater rhetorical appeal than scholarly publications, employing dramatic narratives, visual media, an accessible language that contrasts with the technical discussions characteristic of academic Assyriological research. Many people lack the specialized knowledge necessary to evaluate competing interpretations critically, instead relying on criteria like narrative coherence, emotional resonance, and conformity with pre-existing beliefs. The commercial incentives supporting alternative interpretations create structural barriers to correction. Publishers, documentary producers, and content creators profit from sensational claims that attract large audiences regardless of scholarly accuracy. The academic consensus interpretation of the Anunnaki as ancient divine judges lacks the dramatic appeal of extraterrestrial genetic engineers, making it less commercially viable in popular media markets. This commercial dynamic ensures continued production and dissemination of alternative theories that scholars have thoroughly debunked, as profitability rather than accuracy drives content creation in popular markets. The examination of primary cuneiform sources reveals that the ancient Mesopotamians understood the Anunnaki as divine judges who determined human fates, presided over the underworld, and maintained cosmic order according to established divine law. These beings functioned as cosmic administrators within a sophisticated theological framework that conceptualized divine governance through institutions, procedures, and legal principles rather than through arbitrary personal power. The consistency of Anunnaki portrayal across 2,000 years of Mesopotamian literature, their integration into complex divine genealogies and kinship networks, and their conventional cultic requirements all demonstrate that they represented theological rather than technological concepts. The modern reinterpretation of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial beings reflects contemporary cultural concerns rather than ancient Mesopotamian beliefs, revealing how popular audiences project modern anxieties and desires onto ancient texts they interpret without sufficient linguistic or historical knowledge. Understanding what ancient Mesopotamians actually wrote about the Anunnaki requires engagement with the cuneiform sources in their original languages and cultural context, an effort that reveals sophisticated ancient theology rather than hidden technological secrets. The comprehensive examination of cuneiform sources, documenting the Anunnaki, across 2 millennia of Mesopotamian civilization reveals a theological concept of remarkable consistency and sophistication. These beings functioned as divine judges within a complex cosmic bureaucracy, presiding over the underworld realm where they determined the fates of deceased souls according to established cosmic law. Their characterization remained stable from the earliest Sumerian texts of the 26th century BC through the final Neo-Babylonian compositions of the 6th century BC, demonstrating that this represented core theological understanding rather than evolving mythological speculation. The Anunnaki's integration into comprehensive divine genealogies, their participation in family relationships following conventional Mesopotamian kinship patterns, and their roles within institutional structures including divine councils and juridical assemblies, all position them as native members of the Mesopotamian pantheon, rather than as external visitors or anomalous beings requiring extraordinary explanation. The textual evidence demonstrates conclusively that ancient Mesopotamian scribes understood the Anunnaki through theological rather than technological frameworks. The complete absence of technological vocabulary, material artifacts, or mechanical descriptions throughout the extensive cuneiform corpus contrasts sharply with the detailed technical language Mesopotamian texts employ when documenting actual technologies. The Anunnaki received worship through conventional ancient religious practices, including temple rituals, sacrificial offerings, and liturgical invocations that conform entirely to expected patterns for ancient Near Eastern religion. The archaeological evidence from temple sites throughout Mesopotamia supports this interpretation through recovery of material culture, showing no anomalous technological elements, despite thousands of artifacts documenting religious practices associated with Anunnaki worship. The transformation of the Anunnaki from divine judges into extraterrestrial genetic engineers represents a distinctly modern reinterpretation that emerged not from new evidence or improved scholarly analysis, but from popular speculation beginning in the mid-20th century. This alternative interpretation gained cultural traction by resonating with contemporary fascinations, including ancient astronaut theories and desires for scientifically informed creation narratives that preserve elements of cosmic purpose and intentional design. The persistence of this reinterpretation, despite thorough scholarly refutation, reveals important dynamics in contemporary knowledge production, where commercial incentives, media accessibility, and popular appeal often outweigh scholarly accuracy in determining which interpretations achieve widespread cultural influence. Understanding what ancient Mesopotamians actually believed about the Anunnaki requires engagement with primary cuneiform sources through rigorous philological methods that respect the linguistic, cultural, and historical contexts within which these texts were composed. The Assyriological consensus interpretation represents the cumulative result of over a century of specialized scholarship by hundreds of experts who read ancient languages fluently and employ peer-reviewed research standards. This scholarly interpretation reveals sophisticated ancient theology that addressed perennial human questions about cosmic order, divine justice, legitimate authority, and the relationship between earthly and celestial governance. The Anunnaki as divine judges administering cosmic law according to established procedures represents a far more intellectually sophisticated concept than crude alternative theories proposing extraterrestrial colonization. The significance of this investigation extends beyond correcting misinterpretations of ancient texts to illuminating how contemporary culture engages with historical evidence and constructs knowledge about the past. The popular success of alternative AN-NUNNA-KI theories, despite their scholarly invalidity, demonstrates that many people assess historical claims based on narrative appeal and ideological compatibility rather than on evidential rigor or expert consensus. Recognizing this dynamic becomes crucial for maintaining intellectual standards that distinguish between evidence-based interpretation and imaginative speculation. The ancient Mesopotamians deserve the respect of having their actual beliefs understood accurately, rather than having modern fantasies projected onto their sophisticated theological traditions. The cuneiform texts speak clearly when approached with appropriate linguistic knowledge and historical understanding, revealing that the Anunnaki were precisely what the ancient sources consistently describe: divine judges who presided over the cosmic legal system that maintained order between the realms of the living and the dead.